You are listening to the Booktrospective Podcast, a podcast for all types of books. And even though we read all types of books across all different types of genres, we want to give a disclaimer. Many of our books and a lot of our content sometimes is intended for mature audiences. And we don't believe in censorship, but we do want our listeners to have the opportunity to decide if our episode or podcast is good for them. So with that, let's get into the episode. Hey, it's Dominique.
And Keely.
And you are listening to Booktrospective. And this week we are doing Invisible Sun by Kim Johnson. I was like, wait. I know this one. But both Keely and I might cough or sneeze or whatever. I don't know. The weather is just, it's hot one day. It's snowing yesterday.
We live in Indiana.
Yeah, we're dying. The weather hates us. So, yeah. Sorry if we sound different or off. That's why. I already know how Keely's week was, but Keely, how's your week?
My week has been crazy. The other day, I had taken my dog. My sister and I took my dog to get a bath at one of the local pet shops, and we pulled into Taco Bell to get my mom a drink, and then hear this big pop, and my back driver window shattered. If it weren't for the tint, the glass would be everywhere. But yeah, so I've been looking around, getting quotes on getting that fixed, and stress of that caused a migraine, but I'm okay now. Here I am. I'm alive. Still a little bit stressy, a little bit depressy, but I'm good.
Stressy and depressing. Adulting sucks. I 10 out of 10 would not recommend adulting. Yeah, I'm good. I don't have much. I went to Cameron, had her last gymnastics meet, so I'm free from that until November, December-ish. But we had to stay, we were 3 hours away, so we stayed somewhere my mom goes. And my mom has a cat. And I'm allergic to them. And I'm like, I'm dying. Because, it's on you. I was like, it's in the air. I'm like, that's what kicked all of this off. Is it was that. I was miserably dying. And then now all of a sudden my nose is just ugh. She doesn't like me very much. So, also today when we record is way in advance. But it's technically March 10th or March 19th. And it's my brother's 10th birthday. So, yeah. But anyways, okay. So, do you have the blurb?
I have the blurb.
Okay.
Let me prepare for this.
Oh, is it long? I still infamously do not look at the blurbs.
Alrighty. Life can change in an instant. When you're wrongfully accused of a crime, when a virus shuts everything down, when the girl you love moves on. Andre Jackson is determined to reclaim his identity, but returning from juvie doesn't feel like coming home. His Portland, Oregon neighborhood is rapidly gentrifying, and COVID-19 shuts down school before he can return, and Andre's suspicions about his arrest for a crime he didn't commit even taint his friendships. It's as if his whole life has been erased. The one thing Andre is counting on is his relationship with the Whitaker kids, especially his longtime crush Sierra. But Sierra's brother Eric is missing, and the facts don't add up as their adoptive parents fight to keep the act that their racially diverse family is picture perfect. If Andre can find Eric, he just might uncover the truth about his own arrest. But in a world where power is held by a few, and Andre is nearly invisible, searching for the truth is a dangerous game.
Yeah, so I had no idea what this book was about. I mean, I figured, okay, I looked at the cover, and I was like, okay, this is a Black trauma book, which is fine. I like those. I did not expect COVID. And I did not expect the, twist at the end. I didn't know where we were going with this, so I guess pleasantly, I don't want to say that because it's not a happy thing, but as a reader, pleasantly surprised. But yeah, so if you could describe this book in one word, what would you say?
I would say that's a hard word to... I would say... Secrets.
That is funny. I was going to say the same thing. But then I was like, okay, I don't want to use that word. So I was going to say like illusion.
Okay.
Or something. So, yeah. Okay. Well, general summary. This book takes place in 2020. So it starts like directly pre-COVID, which is like that time period when we were like, something's going around and it's not the normal, but before we really declared COVID or coronavirus. I'm not going to say coronavirus 100 times. That's how they say it in the book. I said COVID. Every time I took notes, I was like COVID. I'm not typing coronavirus. It's so funny because all I could hear was coronavirus. Like, COVID really was a time. Like, that is just an unreal time. But, yeah, so basically we are introduced to Andre. I'm also going to refer to him as Dre because I'm lazy. So anyways, he is 17, I believe. And he was just released from juvenile detention after 2 months. And he's moving back in with his family. So his grandparents and parents all kind of live together. And he is on a community monitoring program, so he has very strict requirements. He has a 9 p.m. curfew. He can only be like 100 feet from the home base or whatever. He has to do like bi-weekly check-ins in person and then like phone calls with his PO officer or whatever. And basically he really wants to like, he does want to put his best foot forward, but he wants to like confront the people that put him in this situation because he is innocent, although, and he tells us he's innocent, although he did take a plea and accepted guilt for the charges that he was charged with. So it leads him down this path of like, he's trying to walk the straight and narrow, but his neighbors, the Whitakers, are like I don't even know how, like a rainbow family. So the Whitakers are a white family, like a couple. They have 2 children, and they also have adopted 3 minority children, 2 Black and 1 Hispanic. They've lived there like the last 5 or 6 years. And so he's very close with all of them. He has a crush on the daughter that is the Black adopted daughter. And so the brother is missing, and he was involved in like everything that went down with Dre getting arrested. And he's like, I just want to find him to like figure out like, you know, what is up, like what happened, all these things. Also in the middle of all this, we're getting all of this COVID stuff. We have like, they're complaining about Donald Trump. We're getting also the Black Lives Matters protests during this book as well. And so really, it's honestly, it's a lot of things that everyone that could relate to Dre probably felt during this time. It's a very relatable experience, at least for myself, and probably people I know. So this book really like it really hits on a lot of different things. And it's a very unfortunate circumstance, especially putting a spotlight on foster kids, adoption, and also just like abuse of power. Really white privilege, I guess, is one of the big things in this book as well. So I was not expecting where it went at all. I don't know what I expected, but I did not expect what happened. So yeah, if you haven't read this book, I'm sure there's triggers.
Oh yeah, let's see.
While Keely's getting the triggers, I'll go ahead and put my warning up. So if you haven't read this book and you don't want to be spoiled, then this would be a good time to pause. But if you have already read it or you don't mind being spoiled after Keely reads the triggers, we'll go ahead and get started.
There we go. Lord Jesus, it was so hard to find it. Okay. Trigger and content warnings are hate, discrimination, oppression. Oh, okay. I see now. They're a little... Okay. So racism, racial slurs, suicide mentioned, alcohol consumption mentioned, smoking mentioned, false incarceration of a minor, police violence, gentrification, and there's so much more than that they are not putting on this one. Abuse, murder, racism, injustice, COVID-19,
Yeah. I'm trying to think.
Underage drinking and drugs, I believe.
Yeah.
That's all that I can think of.
There's lots of triggers.
That was not a comprehensive list.
Yeah, they didn't do a good job. So there's lots of triggers.
Yes.
So just be aware of that. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So we start. So the chapters I kind of wrote down because one, it gives us the date, and then each chapter title is a song title. So we start February 27th, 2020, and the song is "Don't Speak." And we open up in Portland, Oregon, which is so funny to me because for the longest time, and I still feel this way, that like black people don't live in Portland or in Oregon. And I actually met someone, I work at a university. I met someone like 2 years ago and she's from there. And I said, black people live there? And she was like, no, not very many. So yeah. So this is all in Dre's point of view. And so he's like, I live on the blackest block in the whitest city. He is with Marcus. Marcus is his probation officer, and they're drinking coffee, which he hates coffee, but he's just like, I'm just trying to bide my time so I can get home because Marcus is taking him home from juvie, and he's just like, I'm just trying to get there. And he feels like he's so close to his freedom. Marcus is a black guy, and he used to be a teacher, and so Marcus seems different than and he's had other encounters with probation officers. Marcus really does seem to care, but Dre's just like, okay, but you're still a probation officer, like, because Marcus tries to be like, oh, like, I'm like your uncle. He's like, no, you're not. Which is funny. My mom was actually a juvenile probation officer for like most of my childhood, and so like it's an awkward thing. So yeah, but anyway, so Dre's moving in with his grandparents. At this point in time, I was like, where are his parents? But they are in the picture as well. But he's like concerned that his parents aren't going to look at him as Andre anymore. So he really goes by Andre. But when he went to juvie, like they all started calling him Dre. I'll call him Dre because I'm being lazy. But he doesn't want his grandparents' opinion of him to change. And like basically, again, he's talking about how he doesn't trust Marcus because no matter what, Marcus is a part of like the justice system. Like he's just like, that's his job. So we learned that Dre's mom is a nurse. His dad is, he owns like a bookstore. It's a Black History bookstore. And he wonders if his dad will be home when he gets home, like waiting for him. And we learned that he's been gone for 2 months. When he gets there, his grandfather's at the door and his grandma comes out and hugs him. And she has like gloves on saying like, coronavirus is coming. I'm like, oh. People, like the things that y'all did in 2020, like with the gloves and the masks and the shields and the bags over your heads.
Oh,
like
the craziness.
People are gonna look back in 100 years and be like, what?
I look back 4 years from and I'm like, what?
Well, we didn't have toilet paper. Why did you take all of the toilet paper? Okay, it's a time. So he looks at his grandma's hands and he's just like thinking how his mom always told him that an old woman's hands like have like power in them and like they're anointed. And he's basically, Marcus comes up to his grandparents and is telling them about the program that Dre is in. And so he calls him Dre, and his grandma's like, it's on Dre. Like he ain't no Dre. And Marcus says like the program basically involves like the family in the process. Dre is on a GPS tracker. He's essentially on house arrest. So he has a GPS tracker. He's required to do community work. He has to charge his ankle bracelet for 2 hours a day, which would drive me absolutely insane. I don't want to be on a plug for 2 hours a day. I mean, I guess you can do it while you're asleep, hopefully, but like you're going to yank your foot.
Yeah, toss and turn.
Yeah, so I'm like, that would drive me insane. And his grandpa is like, can he get it wet? Because we all learned that Andre is a swimmer. He loves to swim. And Marcus basically says, yeah, because Dre's happy about that because he wants to swim. He has a 9 p.m. curfew, and basically they're going to track all of his movements. He can't go back to school until after spring break because, like, the school didn't want him to come back until after spring break. And his grandparents are like, y'all want to see him fail? Like, y'all want to keep him out? He's a senior. Like, he needs his stuff. His grandma wants him to go to church, of course. and Marcus says he can't because, or no, one of them, either Marcus or Dre, is like, no, I can't because that Sunday is the day that he has to go to the Parks and Rec facility, which is where the community pool is. He basically has like a job assignment, or that's his community assignment is there. And his grandpa says, on a Sunday, you need Jesus. I'm like, oh my God, dear Lord. Okay. So Marcus tells him he'll be in contact with him twice a week and he'll do a surprise visit once a week. And this program is for 6 months until Dre turns 18. Chapter 2, the song is I Can't Go For That. It's still February 27th. And Marcus leaves and Dre just starts like Trump's like on TV talking about like COVID and talking about the numbers and fake news or whatever. And Dre's like, I can't stand him. Like, he gets on my nerves. So he wants to go to his room, but he knows if he goes in there and like lays down, his grandpa's gonna find something for him to do. So he just sits up and waits for his dad. So his dad and his mom both weren't home when he got there. And he's really just starting to notice how, like, even though he had to sit still for 2 months, the world just kept moving. And he thinks of when he went to jail and he regrets that night. So basically, he was arrested at his grandparents' house. It was New Year's Eve. Or no, he had went to a New Year's Eve party, I believe the night before. And he is thinking about how Mr. Whitaker, who we will learn the Whitakers are their next door neighbor to his grandparents, he had went over there for New Year's Eve. And Mr. Whitaker, the dad, was like, here, have champagne. And he's like, that's the first bad thing he did. And he basically is thinking about how he had took this night off to like chill like his other friends could chill, but he knows like better. He's basically like, I'm a black kid, I don't get those leniencies and luxuries of like doing what the other kids do. And he just wishes he would have went home or went to another friend's house. But what he ended up doing was going to a party because Sierra Whitaker is the black adopted daughter, and her brother Eric, and they're biological siblings, so they were both adopted by the Whitaker family. They had decided to go to a party. Dre tagged along because he likes Sierra. And basically, he kind of feels like Mr. Whitaker likes him hanging out with the black kid, like their kids, because Dre is a good kid and he kind of keeps them in check. But he's like, Eric doesn't understand that we can't do what our white friends do, basically, because Eric is being raised by this white family and he's like, just, I don't know, not used to it. Like, he doesn't think. And by that, he means like, you know, we don't get away with stuff and people are looking at us weird. Like, we can't just do everything that we see our friends doing. And he also feels like Mr. Whitaker likes him around his kids because basically he thinks Mr. Whitaker knows that, like, as a white man, he hasn't really introduced his black adopted kids into, like, black society. And so by hanging out with Dre, that, like, connects them to their blackness, essentially. So when he was around 10 years old, Dre's, like, reminiscing about how his dad had to talk with him about, like, what does it mean to be a black person in the United States of America? Like, what does it mean when we're getting pulled over and all of these different things? And the night that he was arrested, he actually was in his room going live on YouTube when they came in and got him. And so essentially what happened was at that New Year's Eve party, some things got stolen. And he knows that it was Eric Whitaker, so the next door neighbors, and then Eric's friend Gavin. They went to a party, and the person having the party, his name is Paul. And basically, they had been doing this, like, at all the parties. Like, they go to parties where people get drunk, they steal from them, whatever. But Dre's like, I never had any part to do that. Like, and basically, like, he's like, I was only there for, like, 10 minutes. Like, I don't have any part of that. And so when they came and arrested him, at first he was like, okay, I wasn't there. Like, he tried to lie. But that quickly was, like, found out because he was, like, one of 3 black kids that were there. So obviously they knew that Dre was there. And basically he was trying to live by that, like, I don't snitch code, which I just want everyone to know. And I tell people all the time, I'm telling on you. Don't do crimes around me. I will tell on you. I don't go to jail for anybody. I will tell on you. So he was like, Dre's like, I'm trying not to snitch on my friends. And so he, like, basically he started putting, like, all these lies on top of lies, and they just started catching up with him. And they ended up finding a backpack of stolen stuff in his Parks and Rec locker. So Mr. Whitaker got him a lawyer, and what they find out is that Dre was only ever the only suspect. Like, they never even suspected Gavin or Eric. And he didn't snitch on them because he felt like even if he did tell on them, that he would still be looked at as an accomplice. And so he didn't want to blow this up into some big, like, robbery scheme and then end up going to, like, actual prison if he got transferred to adult. So he just ended up taking a plea deal, which is probably what his lawyer suggested. And that's how he ended up in juvie. So he also mentions, like, his dad never really believed him when he said it wasn't his stuff, like, in the locker. And his dad is now 2 hours late getting home. And his grandma, like, keeps, like, dragging out finishing dinner, hoping that his dad will get home. So it's not so noticeable. But they're like, let's just go ahead and eat. So Dre asks, like, is my dad often home late? And basically he feels like neither one of his parents cared enough about him to change their schedule this one day so that they could be home and see him when he comes home. So they start to eat, and the phone rings, and his grandpa answers it, and then he just says, like, on the phone, like, okay, I'll tell the boy or whatever. And his grandpa is like, basically, your dad's doing inventory. He's going to be home late. And all Dre can think is, like, there's not really any point of, like, fighting. And, like, the harder you fight, like, the faster you sink, basically. Chapter 3 is Every Time I See Your Face, and it's still February 27th, so the same day. And now he is looking out the window at the Whitakers' house. So the Whitakers live across the street, and he watches them pull up. He really just wants, like, confirmation to see, like, okay, since I went to jail for Eric, I want to see that he, like, changed his life. He got rid of everything else that he stole. And he sees the car pull up. He sees another car pull up, and he's hoping that it's his dad, but it's the Whitakers. So the Whitaker kids, there's Brian, who is their biological son. He is in college, but he still lives at home. Then there's Kate, and she's a senior, like the same age as him, and Sierra, which is the first adopted daughter. Then there's Eric, and then there's also Luis, who is the youngest of them. He is a Hispanic boy that they adopted. He's a freshman in high school. He starts thinking about Sierra. He's basically, like, been in love with her forever. But he thinks about the fact that she never wrote him the whole time he was locked up. Like, never checked on him. And, like, they've never officially, like, been together. Like, he's been trying to, like, get with her for years, and it's never happened. So Sierra gets out the car and looks towards the window, and she sees him. So she goes in the house, and she just, like, leaves their door wide open, which is, like, I guess the signal, like, to come over. And so, like, he goes over there, but he stops and he knocks on the door, which isn't something he normally would do. But, like, he's like, everything's different now. Like, I don't know if these people want me walking in their house or whatever. And Sierra's like, are you just going to stand there all day? So he goes in, and Mrs. Whitaker sees him and is like, oh, do you want to stay for dinner? And he ends up staying. He goes past Mr. Whitaker's office, and he stops, and he's, like, conflicted because he actually wants to thank him for, like, the lawyer. So he knocks, and Mr. Whitaker says that he's happy to see him. And he basically tells him, like, after working with your case, I've decided to run for city commissioner. So he's running a political campaign now. And Dre thanks Mr. Whitaker, and Mr. Whitaker's like, oh, like, it's no problem. Like, you know, you're, like, one of my kids, blah, 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 blah. Dre wants to see Eric to, like, talk, because they haven't had a chance to talk since the arrest and everything. And I'm like, that's a bad idea. You don't need to talk to Eric. You need to stay away from Eric. But he's not there. So Mrs. Whitaker asks Dre, like, are you going to be staying at your grandparents as part of your release? And he just, like, lied. He's like, well, I'm really just staying over here, like, to help them out, like, not because of, you know, the release or whatever. And Mrs. Whitaker starts talking about how Kate's going to be going to Brown next year, pre-med, and basically she's always had this plan for Kate to go to Brown pre-med, but Kate has never shown any interest in doing this. And all of the Whitakers, like, they're having, like, their dinner talk. They're complaining about how, like, their house just doesn't have enough space for all of them. And he thinks of, like, his cramped apartment. So he has always, like, he's not well off. Like, his parents struggle. And what we'll find out is that his parents are also living with his grandparents. But he doesn't want them to know it. So they've had apartments, but right now they're all, like, living together. Brian asks Kate after dinner if she's actually going to tell their mom that she didn't get into Brown. And she's like, I did not get in. She basically lied and said she got in early admission and, like, made a fake acceptance letter, but she didn't get in early admission. But she just wants her mom to, like, stop talking about Brown all the time. And Dre asks them, like, when is Eric going to come home? And everyone just kind of goes silent, and it's really weird. And all of a sudden, Sierra just gets up and runs out. So the other kids tell him, like, Eric ran away. And they say he ran away the week that you got picked up and went to jail. They said he packed up all of his stuff, he called and said he wasn't coming back, and now he doesn't talk to any of them, not even Sierra. And this is really weird because, for one, like, him and Sierra obviously are blood siblings. They've been together their entire lives. And normally, like, in this household, the siblings always, like, join up. So, like, Kate and Brian will team up, and then Sierra and Eric would always team up, and Louise was kind of like their, like, dividing, like, their last vote to, like, pick a side, basically. So his grandma calls him and is like, hey, don't forget you got 9 o'clock curfew, even though he still has an hour. And he's like, I have time, and, like, I'm within the 100-foot barrier or whatever. And he's also thinking about how his mom actually hates Mrs. Whitaker, so she wouldn't want him over there anyways. Like, she thinks she's, like, you know, uppity and snooty and stuff. So he starts wondering, like, if Eric left, does that mean, like, there's going to be more charges coming, and that's going to hurt him? So he goes to look for Sierra. She's sitting somewhere else in the house, and the boy from the party, Paul, so he was the one who had the party where things got stolen, he's in there, and, like, he's not just sitting with her, like, they're canoodling. And he's like, what? Like, not only is it with Paul, like, I like you, girl. Like, don't do that. So, and then, like, Paul kisses her. He's like, oh, okay. So he's like, he basically doesn't feel like he fits in here anymore. Chapter 4 is Sweet Dreams, and it's February 28th. So that night, he has nightmares of being in prison, and he doesn't feel free. And his mom wakes him up in the middle of the night, and he, like, jumps, like, almost defensively. And what we learn is, like, his dad ended up coming home really late and, like, just went straight to bed. Never even, like, came, talked to him, anything. So he's pretty hurt about this. And he thinks about how, as he's, like, waking up, his mom has no idea what he really went through. So we find that he was actually jumped the first night that he was in juvie, and he never told anyone about it. And he never told anyone when he was leaving because he was afraid they were going to, like, jump him on his way out. So he's basically, like, you know, lived these last 2 months, like, in fear of getting beat up all the time. And I was like, this makes me think of the Central Park 5. Have you ever watched that documentary? Mm-hmm. I, like, boohoo cried so hard every time I think about it. And I just, it makes me so sad. His mom, like, holds him and is like, are you okay? And this, like, he finally breaks down because every time she would come and see him, he was just like, I'm good. Which is, like, what most people will tell you. Like, a lot of times people who go to prison are like, there's no, like, what's the point of me burdening you? Mm-hmm. And, like, a lot of times they'll even, like, some people call home from prison all the time, like, ridiculously amount, but some people choose not to because, like, it's so depressing to them. Like, I don't want to call home and, like, what are y'all doing? Like, I don't want to, like, just, like, oh, we're going out to dinner. Like, we're going to the movies. Like, that is so depressing. So a lot of people do that, like, I'm just fine, like, that detachment thing. And so now he's finally, like, breaking down, and he just tells his mom everything about how he was, like, got jumped, about how he was scared. He was scared of, like, sleeping. He was scared of the showers, even though no one tried anything in the showers. But he just, you know, everyone's heard, like, don't drop the soap, like, all that stuff. So he was, like, freaking out. And then he says, like, dad didn't come to dinner, and basically he can tell that his parents have, like, some kind of financial strain because his mom is working way over than she normally does. And he basically, it's like early morning. He's like, well, I'll just go see dad before work. And she's like, he's already gone. So not only did he come in late and didn't say anything, he left the next morning and, like, you don't want to see your kid? Like, dang, like, oh my gosh. And his mom ends up falling asleep in his bed because she's just so exhausted. So he goes down to breakfast. Trump's on the news again, talking about COVID numbers and talking about, oh, it's all handled, blah, 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 blah. So him and, like, his grandparents are, like, talking about how they can't stand Trump. And, of course, on the wall, they have a freaking framed Obama. Like, every elderly black person in the United States of America has a framed Obama picture, and I think that is so wholesome. So his grandpa actually admits, though, he was like, well, I voted for Trump in the primaries. And him and his grandma are like, what? And he's like, well, I mean, like, he had a good business background, and he was like, all the parties are bad anyways. And they're just like, I can't believe you just said that. So he tells his grandpa, like, oh, my friend Abraham's gonna come over, which he calls him Abraham because, like, you know, older people hate when you call people by their nicknames. But he calls his friend Boogie, like, that's his real name. But he's like Abraham to, like, you know, sound good. And his grandpa basically is like, well, who's this kid, whatever, because his grandpa pretty much is like, he feels like if you're perfect, then, like, you'll stay out of trouble, which also is, like, a mentality I feel like a lot of older black people have, because that's where they just were taught to, like, walk the line, just do what you're told, like, don't, like, make any, like, discrepancies or anything. So it's definitely, like, a trauma response. And he only wants Dre hanging out with kids who, like, don't get in trouble, who have good grades. And so he's like, yeah, like, Abraham's a good kid. Abraham, that's so funny. So, and then Dre was like, he was like, being perfect and joining Jack and Jill won't save you. I literally just learned what Jack and Jills were, like, last week. I saw it on TikTok. Do you know what Jack and Jills are? So Jack and Jills are, like, they're, like, black organizations for kids who, like, they end up, like, basically the parents are, like, affluent. So I'm in a sorority. I'm in a black sorority. And, like, we have groups like that for, like, our young kids. And then, like, they'll go to cotillion and stuff like that. But Jack and Jill's, I don't think you have to be, like, in a D9 sorority or anything. But I just never had heard that term before. Yeah, and I was like, what's a Jack and Jill? And I'm like, that's so funny that he said that, because I literally just learned about it, like, last week. So, Jack and Jill's. So, it's like, it's probably like it's like the golf club, but for black people and their kids. I don't know. Anyway, so he runs outside because he's trying to beat the trash truck and get the trash out. And there's a white lady outside, like, letting her dog poop in their yard, which he's annoyed about. And she yells at him, even though she's in their yard, and was like, you need to watch it. And he's like, it's me, Andre. And she says, we don't take kindly to people going through our trash. Ma'am, what? Like, I'm clearly going out with the trash. You're in my yard. And now all of a sudden you don't know me. Okay. So his friend Boogie comes over, knocks on his window, which we will learn, like, everybody, don't nobody go to the front door at this house. They all knock on his window. And so they knocks on his window, and then he goes around to the front and comes inside. And his grandpa's like, don't come in here with no manners. Take your shoes off and your hat. And like his pants were sagging. Like he was like, get it together. He's like, I don't know why you kids want your pants hanging off your butt. That's what they all say. It's so funny. So Boogie and Dre are going to go run some errands for his grandparents. And his grandpa's like, go straight there, come straight back. So Boogie like drives, she has a car. So they get in the car, and Dre just thinks about how nice it is. Like, they don't have to talk and like just feel the silence, which is nice. And Boogie's like, yeah, my mom keeps spraying me down with Lysol. I'm telling you, the COVID precautions. So they pass Sierra coming home, and Boogie asks, like, have you talked to her? And Dre is like, how could you let her hook up with Paul? And Boogie's like, I mean, what'd you want me to do? Stalk the girl? Like, how was I going to stop her from hooking up with Paul? Like, I don't have nothing to do with that. And Boogie's like, she's just with him for his money. And then they talk about basically how nobody at Dre's school would be a character witness for him. Like, the principal basically told his parents, like, oh, like, that's not allowed, basically. But, like, none of his friends, quote unquote friends, no one would, like, be a character witness during his case. So that didn't help him. And Dre asked Boogie about Eric, and is like, Boogie's like, oh, I thought you knew that he was gone. And Boogie basically says, like, I think Eric framed you. And Dre is like, no, I don't think it was Eric. I think it was Gavin. Like, Eric wouldn't do me like that. He's like, I think Eric is just, like, more so naive. Then he realizes, like, Boogie's taking him, like, somewhere, and he's taking him to his dad's bookstore. So even though he didn't, like, ask to go there, Boogie knows, like, you ain't seen your dad. I'm gonna take you there. And so we go to chapter 5, and the title is Juicy Don't Let Them Hold You Down. And it's February 28th still. So his dad has a Black History bookstore, and he's just thinking, like, nobody cares about Black History no more. Like, his dad's business is not doing well. And he considers how his personal history is affecting his dad. And they see there's a notice on the door. So this bookstore has, like, this, like, nice Black History mural. And, like, somebody keeps trying to offer to paint this store for free, basically, like, to get rid of the mural. So they go in, and his dad, like, comes around, and then he's, like, kind of disappointed, but he knows it's, like, it's not disappointed to see him. It's basically, like, his dad needs customers. So he's like, oh, like, I thought I was going to have customers. And his dad's like, I was coming home early, like, you didn't have to come see me. And he considers how his dad has, like, always been there for him, and how he taught him to apologize for things he didn't even do. Like, when somebody called him the N-word before, like, his dad's like, you just gotta, like, you gotta roll with the punches, basically. And so his dad is, like, trying to tell him, like, well, you can help around the shop. But then Dre's like, okay, I'm going to call my grandma, like, just check in. And something about that makes his dad stop and is like, well, like, maybe we can work out a schedule. And he just feels like his dad can't wait for him to leave. And, like, his dad just doesn't, like, look forward to Dre's future anymore because of him going to jail. Chapter 6, It Was a Good Day, February 29th. When they get back to the house, Marcus is there waiting, and Marcus is like, oh, you've been active today. And Dre feels like, what's the point of me being out if I'm going to be monitored? Which I say all the time. People get, like, 5-year house arrest. I just send me to prison. If I could do, like, 1 year of prison versus 5 years of house arrest, I think I would just go to prison for a year. Like, I don't want somebody constantly, like, do it. Like, that would stress me out. I feel the same way. Like, what is the point? But I also have never been to prison, and I never plan on going. So I hope to never find out. But Marcus is like, I'm not trying to be hard on you, but he tells Dre, like, look, my old mentor, his name is Jim. He basically, like, he had Dre's case before Marcus got it. Well, he felt like Marcus is being too lenient on Dre, which is why Dre even got put on the ankle bracelet in the first place, was because of this Jim guy. And he's basically like, Jim is watching your monitor just like I am. And he's like, so I think he's trying to catch you. So you really just need to be on your P's and Q's. So while he's talking to Marcus, he sees Sierra watching from her window, and Marcus sees her too. And he's like, oh, I see why you wanted to stay over here at your grandparents' house. Like, mind your business, Marcus. So then Marcus asks, like, who Boogie is, and, like, does he have a record? And then he's like, basically tells Dre, like, just let me know, like, if you're going to be out long. So Boogie's like, well, let's go check your YouTube or whatever. And he's like, why? I have like 100 followers or whatever. And his last video, unfortunately, was the video of him getting arrested because he was live during that. And he logs on, and there's over 1,000 shares of that video. And he's like, yeah, I know everyone at school probably saw it. And they watch it, and it, like, really, like, triggers him to watch the video. And Boogie just says, like, he feels like he wish, like, he would have went to the party with them to, like, make sure, like, or made sure he came to his house, like just try to prevent what happened. And so Boogie's like, what are you going to do to get back at Gavin? And Dre like knows, like, he's like, there's no way I'm going to win in this situation if I try anything. And he's like, Gavin already got off because Gavin literally had a lawyer the night that they got arrested. I'm assuming Gavin's white. Does it ever say that Gavin's white?
It doesn't say, but
I was assuming.
Well, I mean, if he was the
he said there was three black
one
kids.
of the only 3 black kids, it would have been
Gavin had to be white because it would have been Eric,
him, Sierra,
yeah. So I'm assuming Gavin's white. Like, I don't think it ever got said, but so Dre just basically tells Boogie like, I've got to leave this alone or like I'm gonna get in trouble, which is smart. Stay smart. Mm-hmm. But they start reading the comments on the video, and a lot of people are like, that's messed up. Like, can we send you bail money? And then like people have still been commenting like, hey, it's been a few months. Like, we're just checking on you. Are you good? And then in the video, he can see Eric in the background watching him be arrested and asks Boogie, like, can you go past Eric's old spots to see if you can find him? And then he looks, and he has over 10,000 followers now. Ooh. Since that video went viral. I wish we had over 10,000 followers. Man. So his channel, normally, like, what his channel is that he reacts to like 80s and 90s songs that he's never heard before. And then like they'll make videos about like the reactions. And he's just thinking about how in the arrest video, he's really proud of himself because, like, he didn't cry. He wasn't naked when he got arrested. And, like, he didn't get, like, beat up in the arrest video. So he's like, at least, like, if my video had to go viral, it wasn't, like, embarrassing.
Did it with dignity.
Yeah. Chapter 7 is Lost in Emotion, Sierra, and it's February 29th still. So then Sierra knocks on the window, and she's like, she joins them, she climbs through the window, and like they're all gonna go live on YouTube. And she basically says she got a notification that said he was live. So like Boogie's in the background of the room, like making kissy faces, like being that annoying friend basically. And then like Boogie just like keeps coughing, and I was like, oh Lord. I'm like, like you couldn't even sneeze around people like for a while. But he's like coughing, and he's like, oh, this cough is killing me. Like, I'm gonna go home. And he's like, I'll see y'all on Monday. And I was like, it's the vid.
Yep.
It's the vid. So Sierra stays and they record, and she tells Dre like she missed him, and it makes him question like why she never contacted him. And she says that, he reminded her of her real family. And he said, did you even read my letters? And she says, yeah, I did. She said at first her parents were keeping the letters from her, but she found them in her dad's desk. And her dad said that he was basically trying to like wait for the right time to give her the letters, but she was afraid to ever respond back because she didn't want them to like start hiding them again, like in a new place. So Dre's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And he asked, like, does she think that Eric maybe went to go find their bio mom? And she's like, no. She says, I'm worried about people judging you, and I'm sorry I wasn't a better friend to you. And they, like, hold hands, and they listen to music, and they start to kiss, but Dre notices, like, bruises on Sierra's wrist, and she's like, oh, like, it's nothing. Chapter 8 is Poison. And it's February 29th. So Sierra leaves, and his grandma comes in, and he's like, can I have some privacy? Which, have you ever grown up in a black house? No, you cannot have any privacy. Like, you better be glad your grandma will take the door off. You had a girl in your room, and she snuck in. I wasn't allowed to have people in my room, like the other sex. And his grandma says, privacy, and she was like, that girl don't know how to use the front door. And she basically is like, don't let her distract you from focusing on yourself. And his grandma starts to cry and says, like, I'm not worried about you getting in trouble. She's like, I'm worried about her breaking your heart, basically. And basically, like, when he was 12, Sierra and Eric had left for a little bit of time. And she's like, I just remember, like, your heart broke and you were so sad while they were gone. And, like, she just doesn't want to see his heart get broken. So he's looking out the window and he sees Paul pull up, and, like, Sierra sneaks out of her window. So he's like, what the? Like, you were just over here with me. Like, what's going on? And his grandma says, like, basically, Sierra's always sneaking out, and she's always arguing with her family now. So he's thinking about the bruises, and he's like, okay, like, is Paul doing this to her? And so he goes and sits on the porch with his grandma eating pie, and that's when she tells him about, like, the 12-year-old thing and his heart being broken. And she tells him, like, you can't heal someone else. You just have to heal yourself and, like, hope that they do the same thing. And she's like, Sierra wants someone to love her and not leave her. And basically, like, you just left for 2 months, and that scares her. So that's probably why she went to Paul. His grandma says that Eric left and then had left for, like, a day. And then she did see him come home once. And she saw, like, Mr. Whitaker with him, but then like the next day he was gone again. So she gives Dre like 2 pieces of pie and like basically says, take this over there to Sierra and Louise. And he starts walking over there and sees Louise like on the roof smoking a cigarette. And he's like, he knows if Eric was around, like he would not, like he would basically like smoke the whole pack and make himself sick just to make Louise like not even think about doing it anymore. So he asks Louise like, what's up with the smoking and like what's going on with your schoolwork? Like basically it seems like Louise is kind of acting out. And Louise is like, I know how not to show out so I don't get shipped off to military school. And Louise says, like, I could go to military school right now or anytime, but there's nothing out there for me. And so Dre's basically like, you know, what happened to Eric? And Louise says, are you checking on me because you care or like you want revenge on Eric? And Dre says, like, no, I care and I want to know if I should be worried, basically. Louise thinks that Eric was scared and basically got rid of any evidence before he left. And Dre asks, why does Gavin keep coming around then? And Louise says he doesn't know anything. Dre tells him to leave Sierra's pie like in her room and asks if Sierra's okay. And Louise just says she's Sierra. So Louise leaves and Dre just thinks like about how it feels like Louise is like has to be like more grown than like what he should have to be at his age. So that night, Dre searches like over social media and he DMs Eric to say like, hey, I'm back or whatever. And he finds a note in his room from Sierra and basically she wrote down a list of all the videos that she watched of his or like they did together while he was gone. So chapter 9 is still Dre and it's March 1st. And Dre is on his way to, I don't know if it's work, community service, whatever it is. He's on his way to the Park and Rec's place and he's still looking for Eric. And he stops at like a convenience store and asks a lady if she's seen him. And she basically said like it's been a few months and that Sierra has basically been around asking for him too. So he goes to the pool and basically like we learn like he loves swimming. I think he was on the swim team. He's a lifeguard. And I'm like, that's actually like crazy because, and then he starts talking about this too because we know like black people historically do not swim due to like, you know, the slave trade and like things that happened during like Jim Crow era. So it's like a great thing that he swims. And he feels like he's in the doghouse like at the Park and Rec place now because this is actually where they found that bag in his locker. So like that's kind of where some of the arrest went down. And he thinks about how when he was in juvie, there was like a white kid there who had accidentally killed someone and they would call that kid killer, but that same kid would like cry every night and no one ever just asked him like what he needed. And he like is kind of just reflecting on the fact that like no one really like asked Dre like what do you need? They just keep like giving him stuff that they feel like would make him better. So he's at work and he's thinking about Gavin, so he's getting pissed off all over again. And Marcus calls and he's like, okay, I gotta calm down before I talk to Marcus. And like he basically when he was leaving the Parks and Rec, he was like, I'm gonna walk past like Gavin's or something like that. And Marcus is like, where are you going? And he's like, I'm going home. He's like, yeah, let's not take the scenic route. How about you turn around and go the other way? So he decides I'm just gonna call Gavin instead. And Gavin says, like, you know, thanks for not telling on me. I owe you one. And Dre's like, I cannot freaking believe that you're saying this to me. Like, what? And Dre asks about Eric. And Gavin says, like, the last he knew, Eric was going to turn himself in to clear your name. And now he's gone. And Dre is like, you know what? I get it. Like, y'all are boys. And I'm, like, the outsider, basically. And we learned that Eric and Gavin actually had a fight on New Year's Eve. And Gavin says, basically, Gavin says that he was ready to stop robbing because like his dad had kind of found out and Eric didn't want to. And so like they hadn't really hashed that out. But then the next day, like Paul's dad called the police after that party and all that stuff got stolen. And, you know, it all went downhill from there. Dre asks him again, like, okay, so where's Eric? And he's like, I don't know. Like Eric always said he wanted to like live off the land, which Dre's like, he's never said that. Like that sounds weird. And Gavin says, like, you know, we were just kind of storing stuff in Eric's Park and Rec locker. And Dre says, like, no, that was my locker. That wasn't Eric's locker. Like, you idiots. And Gavin just says, like, you know, we were scared. We had over $5,000 in money in there. And Dre's like, no, the bag that they found had fake jewelry and a little bit of money, but it didn't have $5,000 worth of money. And he feels like Gavin's lying, but he's like, where is Eric? And, like, why did he run? Chapter 10 is With or Without You. March 1st still, and he's sitting on the porch with Boogie and telling him about the conversation with Gavin, and he's and Boogie's upset because he's like, why didn't you tell Gavin like he need to watch his back or something like that? So the Whitakers are arguing about Brian living at home. Like the younger kids are basically like, why are you still here? Like get out. And they can hear them all arguing. And Brian is basically telling them that his dad is making him stay home because like allegedly his dad like believes in them like paying their way even though they're rich. Like Brian doesn't get to just be rich because of that. So he's staying at home. So they all like come together and like Boogie's like, yeah, I'm going to MIT. And Brian says, oh, like on a diversity scholarship. And everyone else is like, what? And Boogie says, yeah, I got in on affirmative action. And like he still has not caught on. So the other kids just like start like talking about something else. And Dre's super annoyed because like, why did y'all just let Brian get away with that? So Sierra asks Dre, like, what's wrong? And Boogie says, like, they were talking about what happened on New Year's Eve. And Boogie says Eric needs to set things straight with Dre, basically. Like, Dre deserves to know what happened to him. So Boogie leaves, and Sierra asks, like, what were you going to do to Eric? And Dre says, nothing. Like, I just want to talk to him. And he tells her, like, he thinks Eric is caught up in something bad. And he says, I was with you the whole time at the party. Like, how would I have done the robbery and I was with you? And he kind of realizes that she thought that he actually did it. Like, she was just pitying him, but didn't actually think he was innocent. And maybe that's why she never wrote to him. So he tells her everything. And she says, like, I haven't heard from Eric. And she can't believe that Eric put all the blame for that robbery on him. So Dre says he probably just left because he knows I'll kick his ass when he gets home. And she's like, you have my permission to do so. So Dre is angry because he was always there for Eric and Eric wasn't there for him. And he asks Sierra to help him find Eric and basically says, like, Eric owes you an explanation too. And so she starts crying and basically says, like, I've been searching for him. And she's like, his phone always goes to voicemail and there's no sign of him. Chapter 11 is When Doves Cry. It's March 3rd. And so Drake can hear his parents arguing, and his mom basically is like talking about his mom's a nurse. So she's like basically planning on staying with a friend because she doesn't want to keep coming home and exposing them to COVID. And his dad basically is like, you know, we agreed like us of all being here was for the best. So they're kind of arguing back and forth about that. And Dre's listening outside the door and they open it and they catch him standing there. And he's basically like, so is mom moving out? And his dad says, like, not technically, like, this is just precautionary. So that makes him feel better that, like, they're not breaking up. It's just about COVID. So they have dinner, and then after dinner, his whole family is, like, asking him, like, to do all these different chores and, like, asking if he's been checking in with Marcus. So he's getting annoyed. And his dad and grandpa are, like, they're all talking about COVID. And, like, they're kind of, like, they don't think it's that serious, but they have all these conspiracy theories, basically. But his mom, like, thinks it's getting worse. So Dre leaves to go meet Boogie, and he calls Marcus to check in and make sure he can go to Boogie's. And Marcus says, like, just make sure you call back in and tell, like, Marcus will call him back basically and tell him when it's time to go home. So he gets to Boogie's, and his mom and grandma are, like, in the living room, but they're like, don't come close to us, we're sick. Which I'm like, okay, time to go. I'm good. I don't want to be here. And Boogie is, like, in his room. He is coughing. He has, like, a diffuser on, and there's tissues everywhere. And Dre's like, yeah, this does not look good. But then he still goes in the room. I'm like, what do you mean? I said, like an idiot. He goes in the room and opens the window. That little air is not doing anything in there. All the germs everywhere. You were sitting in germs. So Boogie asks about, like, Sierra, and Dre says, like, you know, she seems like she's moved on, but Boogie says, no, she likes you. You were just gone, and you never made a move before that. So they talk about looking for Eric, and then Marcus calls early saying, like, I just want to make sure you're not making any plans for, like, your big return. And Dre ends up leaving because, like, Boogie's just, like, too sick. So he's on his way home, and then he sees, like, there's this van, and a window rolls down, and it's Jim, the old probation officer, and he's like, you're cutting it close, aren't you? And he says, like, you're going to slip up one day, and I'm going to catch you, and you're going to do the rest of your time. So he is out to get him. And Dre says, like, I was literally just talking to Marcus, and Jim says, like, Marcus is too easy on you. So he goes to call Marcus back, and Jim is like, no, like, let's keep this between us. So Drake is in the house, and he's, like, crying, and his parents ask what's wrong, and he basically breaks down and tells them everything about New Year's Eve and about Officer Jim outside. His dad wants to talk to Mr. Whitaker to see if they can still use the lawyer, but his dad is annoyed because he's like, why didn't you snitch? Like, why did you take the fall for that? And he just says, like, I was scared. And his mom asks, like, why is Eric gone? And, like, why did Mr. Whitaker help you, basically? And Dre says he doesn't think Mr. Whitaker knows, but his parents, like, don't talk about Eric. Like, he doesn't want his parents to talk to the Whitakers about Eric. So he goes and checks Eric's Instagram, and he sees Sierra, like, commenting on like, the same post. And she's been commenting, like, call me, please call me. Like, where are you? And it's like, he hasn't made any new posts. It's just the same post. And then he watches a video of, on Eric's page of Sierra's birthday, and Eric is in the background. He's kind of like drunk, and Eric is telling Sierra how like she's always saved him and never gave up on each other. And Mrs. Whitaker like grabs his phone and then tells Eric like, that's enough of you making a fool of this family, and the video ends. Chapter 12 is A Change is Going to Come, March 6th. He gets up that morning and his grandpa is sick. He's coughing, and he asks his grandma, like, do you think it's COVID? And she says no. She says he had a fever all night, but, like, his mom's going to come check on him tonight after work. So Dre goes to the pharmacy to pick up some medicine for him, and he feels like there's a car following him, and he texts Marcus just letting him know, like, my grandpa's sick. So he gets in there, and Mr. Whitaker sees him, and he, like, is like, oh, like, we're here to support you, and we wanted to, like, give you space if you needed that. And he gets the feeling that Mr. Whitaker doesn't want him around Sierra. And then when he goes to check out, Mr. Whitaker pays for his pharmacy bill. And Dre says, like, I know Sierra's hurt about Eric and not seeing him or getting to say goodbye. And he asks, like, if Mr. Whitaker had talked to Eric, and he says no, like, he was gone when I got back. Mr. Whitaker says he's worried about Sierra because she's been in trouble lately, and asks if she's told, like, Dre anything. And then he says, like, you know, there's something I want to tell you about Eric that I haven't told the kids. So Mr. Whitaker says, like, we've kept this from Sierra because we don't want to hurt her. And before basically Eric left, we suspected that he was on drugs. And they found out that he wasn't, but they said that he had a breakdown and he was hallucinating. And they had to have him admitted to the psychiatric hospital for a 72-hour arrest. And that, like, him and Sierra's mom had similar issues, so it might be something, like, genetic. And that basically Eric ran in the middle of the night and said he couldn't trust anyone now, not even Sierra. And so Dre's like, okay, why didn't you tell the other kids that? And Mr. Whitaker says Eric made them promise that basically they would take care of Sierra and wouldn't let her come after him, because if she knew, then, like, she would follow him, and that he was leaving Oregon. And he says that they hope that he would just eventually come home and explain everything, but he hasn't. Dre thinks Mr. Whitaker is wrong because Sierra deserves to know, but he feels like basically he just bought him for his silence by paying for the pharmacy stuff, because, like, the medicine was expensive and they're already struggling to buy, like, his grandpa's meds. Chapter 13 is Killing Me Softly, and it's March 9th. And he just feels really tortured and burdened now by this secret that Mr. Whitaker told him. And Sierra shows up at his window, and he's really been, like, avoiding her. So she's like, are you avoiding me? And he's like, no, my grandpa's sick. And he wants to find Eric before he can tell her, like, what he was told. So she comes in and they just start making videos. And Marcus texts him saying, like, he saw his YouTube channel, basically. And then he hears yelling, and he runs out, and it's his grandpa. His grandpa's, like, grabbing his chest. He sounds super raspy and shallow, and then his grandpa just, like, collapses and goes still. So Eric starts CPR because he is a lifeguard. So he calls 911, starts CPR, and they come and rush his grandfather to the hospital. So Eric and Sierra and his grandma go to the hospital with them, and he really kind of wants Sierra to leave because he can't break down emotionally. Like, he's trying to stay strong in front of her, but she is going to stay. Chapter 14 is All Through the Night, and it is March 14th. So he tried to get, like, an extension on his curfew that night, but Marcus is like, no, you still have to go home. So him and Sierra go back to the house. They make ramen noodles, and she, like, kind of makes, like, a slam. Ugh, it's disgusting. She puts cheese and, like, onions in hers. That's disgusting. He puts hot sauce in his, which I love, because I put hot sauce in my noodles, too. And she was like, you have more hot sauce than noodles. I'm like, perfect. That's delicious. Anyways, the news is on, and basically the governor has now declared a state of emergency for Oregon. He texts Boogie and he says, checking on him, and he's like, yeah, I'm better now, but basically his family is in the hospital, so we pretty much know that they all had COVID. And he tells Boogie about his grandpa, and Dre's surprised that Sierra's parents let her, like, stay over because she's going to stay the night because everyone else is still at the hospital. And she, like, is like, you know, you go to bed and I'll stay in the living room. So he lays down. He's, like, not able to sleep. And she comes in and she's like, I'm just going to make a pallet on the floor, which he's like, no, like, lay in my bed. But she's like, no, I'm good. Like, I can lay on the floor. And she asks him if it's weird being home, and he says yes. She says you never used to want to, she says she never used to want to sleep away from Eric because she thought someone would come in the night and take him. And Dre's like, well, it seems like you got over that because Eric's room's on like the second floor and hers on the first floor. And she basically says like, no, the Whitakers forced me because basically the first week that they lived with them, she would sneak into his room every night. And then finally like Mrs. Whitaker found out and freaked out and basically like made an assumption that they were like having sex. And she was 9 years old. Like, she's like, why would she even go to that? So they basically forced her to have this room like separately downstairs. She says Mrs. Whitaker also used to keep her away from Kate and Brian, and it always felt like she felt like Sierra was going to rub off on them. And really, like, every home that her and Eric have been in, like, they always felt different, and they always had to, like, adjust to them. And so Dre asks, like, well, how has Eric adjusted? And she says he basically just puts on, like, a big show like he's fine all the time to cover up for it. And she says, we've had lots of white foster parents, but actually the last family they were with, that was the most, like, normal for them. They didn't have to force it because I guess they already had, like, black family members in their life, and so things seemed very normal for them. But she says the Whitakers can barely say black. Like, they act like the word black is, like, a bad word or something. And she says the last home that she was in was the first place that she wanted to, like, actually live in. And she said that they got turned away by them because they got new foster kids and they said they might lose their other kids if Sierra kept coming back. So she stopped going to see them. So Sierra goes to sleep and Dre's just thinking like he can't figure out why the Whitakers would keep Eric's illness away from her. And he assumes it has something to do with his arrest. Chapter 15 is holding back the tears, and it's March 10th. Dre is going through like Eric and Sierra's socials like for old contacts, and he ends up finding Susan, who he remembers as their old foster mom. So he sends her a message saying like, hey, I'm their neighbor. Eric's been missing for 2 months. Have you seen him? Can you tell him I miss him? And that Sierra needs to hear from him. The next morning, Sierra wakes up, she stretches, and then like she like coughs or something, and then Dre literally can't move. He's like, my equilibrium's off and like something's weird, and they both just like stare at each other. And they both are like, are you okay? And he's like, I feel terrible. So they call his dad, and like they basically immediately get quarantined to his room. They go get a test, and it's like a half hour away, and a couple of days later their tests come back positive. So they end up quarantined together in Dre's room. His grandpa is still sick, still in the hospital. And Sierra basically is like crying, and she's like, she's mad at Eric, and like she's like, he won't even know if I'm sick, if I die, like he won't even know. And Dre hears his grandma saying like his dad should stay somewhere else, but his dad refuses to, so his dad and his grandma are still in the house as well, even though they're pretty much quarantined to his room. Dre says like, we're gonna die, and Sierra's like, no, like don't say that, we can't think like that. So after several days, they finally start to feel better. The Whitakers have basically been dropping off like meals and supplies and all kinds of stuff. And his dad has been like taking care of things, like bringing it to the door. And he finally feels better enough to like leave his room. And he goes and sees his dad sitting in his grandpa's chair. And he sees like all his grandpa's newspapers like stacking up. And it makes him sad because like his grandpa would send the newspaper and they would be like stiffly folded. And you know how like when you open the newspaper, it makes like that like sound or whatever, like he's like that clack sound, and like he just misses his grandpa so much. And his dad is like, so he sees all the newspapers and he says like, he sees a headline that says like all public parks and non-essential businesses basically have to close. So he calls Marcus, and he basically like, Marcus is like, you talking to me about this and you're not telling me you in the room with this girl for a week, like I want to hear those details. But Marcus says like, I'm sorry, like because the park's closed, so he knows like, okay, I can't do my community service basically. And Marcus is like, I'm sorry, like, we'll try to find you something else or whatever. And Dre notices his dad doesn't look that well, and he knows his dad won't rest because now the bookstore's closed, and so, like, what little money he did have coming in, now he doesn't have any at all. And he figures the bookstore won't survive. And Dre wants to help, but he can tell, like, his dad just doesn't really trust him to be helpful. Chapter 16 is Eric, Are You Okay? And it's March 20th. So he finally gets a message back from Susan, which is the previous foster mom. She says, hey, I actually met you before, but you probably don't remember me. And she says, your message worries me because the last time I talked to Eric was January 3rd. She says he was asking about you actually, and asked like what happened with your arrest situation. Dre says, I got out in February and I have to do 6 months of community program. What did Eric say about me? And Susan apologizes and says, like, Eric didn't want you to get caught up in his mess and that she's disappointed in him, and says he planned to turn himself in the last time they had talked. Dre assumes the Whitakers would have reached out to her as well, so they probably know this information. So he asks if Mr. Whitaker has contacted her, and she says that Eric stayed with her a few days, but actually she contacted the Whitakers because because like CPS and all that kind of stuff, like he can't stay with her, basically. So she says Mr. Whitaker came and picked him up, and then when Sierra came and looking for him, like a little bit after that, she assumed that maybe he got shipped off to like a detention center, and so she didn't tell her that because she didn't want to get her upset. Dre tells Susan that he won't say anything, but he asked if Eric seemed unwell to her, and she says he seems scared and asked, like, do you think he did something to himself? And Dre just says he hopes not. Dre asks Sierra, what if finding Eric would be a bad thing? And maybe he left for your protection. He says, Marcus said my case might not be over. And she asks if that's why you think Eric left. And he just wishes he could tell her everything. And Sierra says, regardless of who their dad is now, Eric getting caught up in the system will be bad. She's like, Eric's destined to fail. And if he like goes to jail, he'll be sentenced pretty hard. And Sierra says, regardless of everything, that she's proud of Dre for protecting Eric, and that if Eric can't trust her with the truth, then maybe like they're not as close as they used to be. And Dre feels terrible for keeping secrets from her. So they both leave his room and see his grandma and his dad, and his dad's basically like he's gonna go stay at a motel because he's not feeling well. So they go to FaceTime his grandpa, and his dad says like, you guys really should go to the hospital and see him, because his mom basically said like they're probably gonna start shutting down the hospitals and they won't be able to get in. And so his grandpa's newspapers are still piling up, and he tries not to look at them. But now he sees an article that basically is exposing how like COVID is really bringing out the fact that there's so many racial health disparities, and how basically like in New York, for example, Black and Latinos were dying at twice of the rate of whites. And like Black and Latinos only made up like 29% of the population, but they were 70% of the people that were dying from COVID. And basically that population of people were being like turned away from clinics. They weren't even being tested appropriately and weren't receiving adequate health care. And I was like, insert here my work experience during COVID. So if you don't know, I am a nurse practitioner. So luckily for me, I did not work front lines at all. I stayed very far away from COVID, but I like worked with a provider who literally like I tested everyone for COVID. If you had any complaint, you were getting COVID tested, because in the same day, I would have someone with no symptoms and every symptom, and they both would have COVID. And so like, it's just like, it was just poor. Like for me, it's ethically like wrong of me to send people on their way and not test them for COVID during that time. And meanwhile, like the provider I work with, he'd be like, he wasn't COVID testing people. Or like, if I would have somebody come and like, they'd be like, well, my wife tested positive for COVID, like, but I'm good. I'm like, no, like you're quarantining. Like, right. I was like, that's why we could not get away with some stuff, because people just would not sit down during COVID. And it's like, I don't care. Like if you live in that house with that person, you have COVID. You have COVID. And like, I'm just going to test you because like some people would only like sneeze once, and some people would have like the fever or the taste, all that stuff. You just could not know. But like, there literally were so many providers who lived by that. Like, well, if you don't test them, you don't know. And like, I didn't know they had COVID. Like, yeah, cause you didn't test for it, cause you didn't want to know they had COVID. So it's like, I had such a rant like during that whole time, and like patients hated me, but I'm sorry. Like, I'm not going to send you out into the world and you can have COVID. Right. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you're going to have to sit at home. That's when, like, the testing was taking, like, 2 days for, like, the PCR, not the rapid test, and, like, all of that. But as a provider, that was my due diligence. So that's, like, my little COVID rant. That's all I got. Anyways, so his mom calls, and like she's on FaceTime. She's in, because she works at the hospital, so she's in the room with his grandpa, and she's literally like covered from head to toe in like gowns and masks. But he can tell like she has wrinkles like around her eyes and just how tired she looks. And he looks at his grandpa and like, oh, this makes me so freaking sad, because like grandparents. But he's like, his grandpa is like so thin. He's like lost so much weight. He's just like wrapped up in this blanket. And his grandma blows his grandpa a kiss, and he like shoots his hand up to grab it, but like that one motion literally like tanked his oxygen, and the monitors start going off, and he has to like take all these heavy breaths just to regain his breathing. And so like Dre just starts like talking, like trying to distract from like all the chaos that starts happening. And we go to chapter 17, which is Make Me Want to Holler, and it's March 31st. So they like finally go to the hospital to try to see his grandpa, and literally like everyone's wearing a mask. There's sanitizer everywhere, which just 2 weeks ago, like none of this was there. And as soon as they get there, there's a sign that says no visitors. And the reception is basically like, yeah, the policy went into effect an hour ago. So like you can't see him. And like his grandma is like, no, I need to see my husband. And she's like basically they have like a glass visiting area, but because his grandpa is so critical, like they can't even risk moving him to the visiting area, so like they can't see him. And his grandma's like breaking down. She's like, how's he gonna get better if he doesn't see me? And so like his mom rushes down and she's like, I tried to call you guys, and she's like, just hang out, like maybe I can get you guys in between shifts because like the policy just went into effect, so like people might not know, like just sit tight or whatever. And Dre pretty much realizes like his grandpa can't breathe on his own, like his grandpa's probably not coming home. And his mom so he texts Boogie and he's like basically like checking on him, and Boogie says like, I'm a lot better, but he says 2 of his family members are on ventilators now at the hospital. And so he decides to like go off to the psychiatric unit because he remembers this whole thing with the Whitaker. So he goes over there and he finds a doctor that he has met like through his mom. And the doctor comes out and is like, oh, how's your grandpa? Like, how's your mom? And he's like, they're good. But he's like, I'm actually here to ask about my friend. And I was like, HIPAA. Right. I was like, she's not going to tell you one thing. And so, like, she's basically like, yeah, like, your mom's mentioned, like, the Whitakers to me. But she's like, yeah, I really can't tell you anything. And she's like, well, I can give you some resources. But then she tells him, like, look, I don't want to send you on a wild goose chase. But, like, basically, like, if that person had been here, I would remember their case. And I don't remember their case. So she's like, basically with so many words, like, he's never been here. And, like, they're the only hospital in town. So, like, there's nowhere else he would have gone. So Dre's like, okay, Mr. Whitaker lied to me. Chapter 18 is Let's Stay Together. It's April 5th. And Sierra's going home soon. And he's pretty sad because they've been quarantined together. And he finally got his school schedule, and they're all doing virtual school now. The Whitakers literally have, like, packages piled up at their house. And he doesn't want to take it unless it's food because he feels like they already bought him off once. And he thinks that they must know where Eric is, but he can't ask because, like, he has to thank Mr. Whitaker for his freedom, so he doesn't want to, like, jeopardize it by getting on them. And he thinks that Mr. Whitaker probably only helped him now out of guilt because he knew that Eric was guilty. He can't get into his classes, and he's like, I'm going to fail, like, I have to drop out of school. Like, you know the COVID stuff with the school, like, virtual school. Terrible. And Sierra's like able to get into her classes, so like she's like, it'll be fine. So anyway, Sierra leaves, and then the doorbell rings, and it's Mrs. Whitaker, and she has like a blinged out face shield. Like, girl, stop it.
Of course,
doing the most. And he basically like wonders if Sierra told him like that they weren't opening the packages. But Mrs. Whitaker hands him a brand new MacBook, and he's like, oh, like, hell yeah, like, I want this. Like, he's like, I'll take this one, because he's like, I'm gonna use this for YouTube, like, because she's like, oh, like, Sierra told me you were having trouble with classes. Like, he doesn't want that for that. He's like, I'm about to get on YouTube. And his grandma says like, oh, you didn't have to do that, but she's like, I just want to thank you guys for taking care of Sierra. And she tells Dre, like, well, there's one more thing. And she said, Sierra won't be able to come over anymore because, like, we're going to keep our circle tight. And we don't know if, like, you can re-catch the virus. And he's like, you know what? Take your laptop back. And he's like, I'm not going to get paid to, like, stay away from Sierra. And so he's like, just take it. But Mrs. Whitaker basically says, like, I don't feel bad. Like, I'm not doing this out of pity. Like, this is just what we do. Like, I'm doing this for all the kids. All the kids can't have their friends over. Like, it's not just Sierra. So he takes the computer, and when she leaves, he can see, like, her walk over to Mr. Whitaker, and he has, like, this satisfied smile as they talk about it. And he's like, yeah, he basically was like, stay away from my kids, basically. So he sets up the laptop, and the first thing he does is search Eric Whitaker, Portland, Oregon, missing. Chapter 19 is Joy and Pain, and it's April 6th. So, the guy at the Park and Rec Center, like the manager, his name is Terry. So Terry calls him and basically is like, we have some options for you. So even though like the Park and Rec can't open, Dre can still come in and like do like service stuff or whatever. So Dre's like, oh, like good, like that'll be good. And his grandma basically ended up getting COVID as well, and she's still recovering, but she's moving a lot slower. And his dad ended up having COVID as well, and his grandpa's still in the hospital. So the next day, Dre's going to the Parks and Rec. Like, the city is completely empty. I loved COVID traffic. That was great. Like, I hated going to work during COVID because I was one of the few people that still had to work. But, like, no traffic was amazing. It was so nice. But anyways, he gets there, and Terry basically tells him, like, he actually feels better when he wears his mask. But then, like, he basically feels like he can't wear his mask because he's like, I'm a big black guy. Like, I can't even wear a hoodie. And, like, now, like, people want me to cover my face. And, like, I mean, you know the stereotypes, like you can't walk around like that. So he like likes wearing his mask for safety, but he feels like he's going to be targeted if he wears it. So he finally gets to swim, and like he feels so free. Like he basically, all of his anxiety, all of his stress is gone, like once he gets into the pool. And he like is swimming, and he sees this other like guy that works there, and he waves at him, but the guy doesn't wave back, and he realizes like he can see his ankle bracelet, and then he's just like pissed off because he's like, immediately, I'm sure this guy was like stereotyping me or whatever. And he gets out of the pool, and Jim's waiting for him, and he says like, basically, he's like, Terry told me I could swim. And Jim says, like, well, when you swim, like, your signal disappears, so I was just checking on you. So he starts to panic because he's like, well, now I can't even freaking swim. Like, what the hell? But Marcus comes in, and he's like, it's back on now. He basically says, like, if you swim closer to the surface, like, that way we get a ping every now and then. It's just when you go really deep into the pool, I can't get a signal. So Marcus tells Jim, like, you can go now. And Jim's like, well, you weren't doing your job. And Marcus says, I was, and he has approval, so I don't need you here. And Jim says, starts to say something else to him, but he's like, you know what? You're not worth it. Dre asks Marcus what he's doing there, and he basically says, like, when you disappeared, I had a hunch that Jim would be here, so I came too. So Marcus leaves, and Dre finishes, like, his stuff for the day, but then he decides to sneak into Terry's office, which I'm like, oh my. But he's like, I know I can get in trouble, but he basically is searching like the New Year's Day, New Year's Eve to see like what happened around the time that his locker was busted to see if he can find anything. But he's like in the dark, and Terry comes in and is like, why are you in the dark? And Dre's like, oh, like I was trying to clear the server or whatever, but I can't figure it out. And Terry says, well, yeah, I upgraded the server. And Terry tells him like the police came asked for video footage after your arrest, and he's like, I just couldn't believe that you would ever do something like that because my gut is never wrong. And Terry says, but you were here New Year's Eve day, and so I guess you could have put the stuff in your locker. But he's like, I know at the very least you didn't do this by yourself. And he's like, are you still going to be caught up in trouble? And Dre's like, no. Terry says, good, because I can't have anyone showing up here. And Dre says, like, no, I mean, I didn't have anything to do with this. And he's like, I know no one wants to hear me say I'm innocent, but, like, I am. And he basically tells him, like, I was trying to look and search the cameras to see who's framed me. And Terry says that basically he knew it the whole time. And he says, the backpack that they found in your locker was not the backpack that I always see you carry, so I knew it wasn't yours. Chapter 20 is Losing My Religion, April 13th. Dre finally is able to like get into his classes, but he goes to the school to try to help his biology teacher prep because she had mentioned like, oh, like you can help me prep for biology. And he gets there and she's like, oh, I'm on Zoom. How the heck is he going to help you prep for class on Zoom?
Right.
That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And she has office hours, so like she's like basically like he helps her or whatever, and then at the end like he's getting ready to leave and she's like, well, next time like let's do this over Zoom. And he's like, you know what, actually I'm not gonna be your lab assistant anymore, like find somebody else. Like don't act like you're scared of me all of a sudden now because I went to juvie. Like don't treat me like that.
And it wasn't even for anything violent.
Yes.
Did it or not, wasn't anything violent. It was stealing.
I stole something at a party. Like I'm not trying to minimize crime, but like
right.
He's like, you've known this boy however long. He's never done anything. It wasn't a violent crime. He's literally being monitored. Like, you're begging. You're begging.
And, I mean, from what it sounds like, he was a great student.
Yeah, like he was your lab assistant, obviously. Like, you liked him before. Now you're terrified of him. After that, he runs to Sierra, and Sierra's like, what's wrong? And he tells her, like, about the biology teacher. And she says, like, well, I want you to meet me tomorrow. And he says, like, what about your parents? And she's like, I don't care about my parents. So by Friday, like, him and Sierra kind of have this routine. Like, they get up in the morning, they go on speakerphone, they get dressed. Like, you know how, like, you sit on the top of your, like, dresser. Like, those TikToks where it's, like, me on the phone with my crush, and you're, like, hanging upside down.
Yes, like, doing all the extra stuff.
Yeah, like, you're, like, sliding up the wall. Like, it's basically that. It's so funny. So he sneaks out to meet her, and they sit on her outside patio. And basically, like, everyone's been complaining about lockdown, but, like, he's like, none of you really know what that feels like to me. Like, this is nothing. Like, this is nothing compared to really being locked down. And he knows them having to do virtual school means that things are getting worse, but no one really wants to, like, say that. And he wonders if his grandpa will ever actually get better. So Sierra asks if he thinks Eric is safe, but Dre thinks that, like, Eric is in some kind of, like, program that the Whitakers put him in. Sierra says how she's upset. Like, she basically feels like she can't show her emotions because she'll just be, like, the angry black girl. And he tells her that she's the most beautiful girl at school.
Oh.
And he thinks how at school everyone like wants to be black, but no one wants to be black. Like they love to associate with blackness, but like no one actually wants to be a black person. And he really like the whole like character witness thing really taught him that. And him and Sierra talk for hours, and she asks like what he would do if this was the beginning of the end, because she says like I wouldn't do anything different. I'll just pretend nothing's changed. And he says like I think it would go like it's been going on. Like I think people will continue to like take stuff for themselves and like the way people are. And she asks like, do you think as a society that we could change for the better? But like he doesn't really answer that. And she tells him like we should do a marathon for YouTube. So she leaves and goes to her room, and like she's like, meet me online in a minute. So he goes in his room and like changes. He puts on like a fresh tee, his necklace, his hat, like fixes his eyebrows, and she's like, what are you doing? And he says, I gotta look good. So they get on live and they have a huge audience, and everyone's like, oh, you guys are so cute together, like, oh, I think he likes her. No, I think she likes him. And then, like, after that live, he gets an email from YouTube saying, like, he can sign up for payments. And he literally made $1,000 from, like, going live. And he was like, okay, I need to give you your cut. And she's like, no, like, you're not giving me a cut. Like, this is your channel. Like, I'm just, like, jumping on or whatever. And so he calls, like, Boogie and tells him everything. And Boogie asks about his grandpa, who's still in the hospital. And, like, Dre feels bad because him and Boogie really haven't been talking lately. And he finds out that his aunt actually passed away from COVID. And the funeral's next week, but no one can even go because of all of the COVID restrictions. Chapter 21 is Every Breath You Take. And it's April 20th. So the city is still a ghost town. And all he can think about is, like, the I Am Legend Will Smith movie. Like... And that's what everybody else thought. And he gets home, and his grandma is like crying with the iPad. And on the iPad, like his mom is standing next to his grandpa, and basically like his grandma says like it won't be long now. And his grandpa is super thin, and like he's on the ventilator. He has the tubes in his throat, and his grandma says like they're gonna take out the tubes, and he's like, why? And she's like, it's just his time. Like, you know, he's been fighting, and it's not getting better, and he's suffering basically. So his mom's like, you know, I'm going to end the call so you don't have to watch this part, and then, like, I'll call back. So she calls back, and they've taken all the tubes out, and his grandpa's still kind of breathing right now, and he thinks how he just looks so peaceful, and they give him more pain medicine, which his mom says will, like, help him transition. And he just thinks about, like, he's never going to get to say his final goodbye. Like, he's like, I would give anything for my grandpa to come home and tell me to give him his clicker. Because he would complain about, like, his grandpa would sit right next to the remote and be like, can you give me my clicker? And he would be so pissed off. And he's like, I would just give anything for him to be here. And so his grandpa flatlines, and his mom just tells him, like, you did good, Dad. And his grandma, like, busts out in tears. And he starts, like, just like panicking. He's like looking at the door like, I know my grandpa's gonna walk in here and ask for his clicker. And then like they also tell him like, you know, his dad's not doing that good, and so they're basically gonna wait till after his dad gets better to have like a memorial service. So then he starts panicking because he's like, okay, like my grandpa just died, and now I didn't even realize my dad was that sick. And she like, so he asked like his mom like, are you really going over there and checking on him? Because they said that, you know, his mom's been checking on him. And she's like, yes, like he has a pulse ox, I'm dropping off food. So he calls his dad and says like he wishes like I just wish I never came home, this is all my fault. And his dad is like, you know, your grandpa is always going to be with us, like it's okay. And he tries to comfort him, and Dre just thinks like he'll do whatever he can to like help his dad's debts and get the bookstore back working, even if he doesn't have to go to college. He's like, that's just another dream deferred. A dream deferred. So chapter 22, I'll Be Missing You. I like that song. April 30th. So they didn't have a wake for his grandpa. People just like leave meals and cards at the door, and honestly he just like wishes they would stop. Like it's overwhelming. But his dad is better, and he's coming home now, and he just thinks like how he's had to help with all these funeral arrangements, which he feels like is something he shouldn't have to do. But today is the funeral, and he wasn't sure if like when he sees his dad if they should touch, but his dad grabs him and hugs him and tells him how proud of him he is. And that's what he's wanted to hear ever since he came home from juvie. His grandma breaks down again at the funeral, and he has borrowed like one of his grandpa's suits for the funeral, and he's just so sad because he was supposed to borrow a suit for prom, but instead he's borrowing it for his funeral. And he's upset because he thinks about like his grandpa's just a number. Like there's not even anything special about his grandpa's death, like because there's so many other deaths surrounding it that like you can't even take in like this death and like really mourn it, and like he'll just be like a number to other people. And all they could have was immediate family, and like probably like his grandpa probably was like a really loved person in the community. Like tons of people probably would have come, and like none of that could happen. But Sierra does come, and like his grandma like looks at the like preacher like, don't you say nothing, that girl can come to this funeral, basically. Chapter 23 is Two Occasions. May 13th. So Sierra's at his window, but he's basically like curled in the fetal position, like he doesn't want to talk. And so she like comes to the front door and she's crying, and like she just hops in the bed with him, and then she just starts kissing him, and then he starts kissing her. But then he's like, wait, no, I don't want to be kissing you like in the middle of my like grief. So he stops. So then she's kind of hurt, and she gets up and she's like, I'm sorry. And she tries to leave, but he's like, no, don't go. And she says, I missed you, and I know this is the wrong time. Like, let's just start over. So he tries to deflect, and he's like, I was in here dreaming about Zendaya, and you woke me up. And like basically, and he says like, did you greet my grandma like that too? Like when you came in the door. So he gets dressed, and like they go in the kitchen, and he finds Sierra like making tea for his grandma, and his grandma's like, she is bossy. Like she kicked me out of the kitchen and everything. And someone knocks on the door, and it's Marcus. And Dre says like, I thought in-person visits were suspended. And Marcus says, yeah, but your monitor isn't reading. And he's like, oh, maybe it's the swimming or whatever. But or no, Marcus thought he might have been swimming, but he went to go see Terry, and Terry was like, no, he's not here. But then Dre remembers last night that something was vibrating, and he thought it was his phone, but he realized that it was his bracelet dying. And he like tries to plug it in, and it won't stay plugged in. And Marcus says like, well, you might have to buy a new set, which might be like $800. So he's like, okay, like I'll duct tape it to the wall. Like I'll make sure it charges or whatever. And Marcus tells him, like, if that dies and you're not at home, even if you're, like, in the perimeter, they can immediately take you to jail, basically, and it could, like, forfeit the program. So he asks Marcus while he's here, he's like, what's the protocol for a missing kid? And he's like, what if a kid's missing and everyone knows it? And he's like, are you planning on running away? And he's like, no, it's a friend. And he says, well, if it's a friend, he's like, if they're under 18, then they'll be in the system if there's a police report filed. But if they're close to 18, realistically, they're probably not going to do anything about it. So Marcus asks for a name, and he doesn't want to give it, but he ends up telling them it's Eric. And Sierra says, after Marcus leaves, Sierra's like, oh, like you can use that battery issue to your benefit. And he's like, I'm not doing that, which I was like, smart.
Right.
Don't do it. And he tells her like, I can go back to juvie because like they're still looking at the case. And she's like, well, I can text Paul and like see what he knows. But Paul's like, I can't talk to Dre. My attorney and my dad said I can't talk to him. His grandma, like, Sierra leaves, and his grandma's like, why were you in there with no mask on? And he's like, like, we both had COVID. And his grandma's like, no, like, we can't take those kind of chances. Chapter 24 is May 25th, is If You Think You're Lonely Now, which is May 25th. If you think you're lonely now, wait until tonight, girl. Okay. I'm so sorry. Don't listen to me sing. Anyways, so Dre's been helping out with the bills and stuff since he's getting YouTube money now, and he hopes his dad doesn't notice because, like, it's probably like a pride issue. And Sierra asks if he feels adventurous, and she basically says, like, Paul's gonna meet me tonight at the park. You should come. I didn't tell him you were gonna be there. And he goes and pisses me off because I was like, oh my God, you're going to jail. You're going to jail. So they go to this park, and Paul doesn't see him at the beginning, so he like hugs Sierra, and then he's like, did you plan this or whatever? But then like all the other Whitaker kids show up, and they decide to play this like fugitive game. I don't know. It's like kind of like it being a hide and seek, whatever. So they're playing this game, and Brian asks, he runs into Brian. Brian asks Dre, like, are you still crushing on my sister? And basically Brian tells him, like, Paul started hanging around when Dre was gone, and that's probably, and, like, Dre thinks, like, oh, it's probably to make up for stitching. Brian says that Paul had tried to make everything that happened look like a real robbery, but it didn't work. So, like, he's basically like, no, Paul didn't really stitch on you. Like, he tried to, but his dad got involved, and he didn't really have anything to do with it. And basically, like, he's like, Paul would do anything to get with Sierra, and he knew Sierra wouldn't forgive him, so, like, that's kind of why he's, like, buttering up or whatever. And Brian says, Eric was always messing up. I'm not surprised he ran away. Like, he makes his own choices. So Dre says, Sierra told me what you did. So then Dre runs into Paul, and he's like, he asked Paul about making it look like a break-in. And Paul says, like, well, my dad was mad about the party, so I tried to cover things up, but it didn't work out. And Dre is just, he's pissed or whatever. And Paul's like, look, if I would have got called in, like, I would have testified for you, blah, 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 blah. But he's like, you protected Gavin and Eric. And Dre wonders if something happened to Eric if he has something to do with Eric missing, if Paul has something to do with Eric missing. And he just thinks like Paul's too perfect and like he must have had to cover up loose ends or whatever. So he asked Paul if he had something to do with the bag in his locker, and Paul's like, no, like I thought that was your stuff. So he legitimately like thought that Dre had been stealing stuff. And Dre asks about Eric, and Paul says like, we all thought that he was going to turn Gavin in, but now he's gone. So he doesn't think that Gavin did anything to Eric, and Paul says that Gavin was asking, was like just asking like, did he think that Eric would come home soon now that Dre was home, but everything's been quiet. Dre hears Marcus in his head, and like he's like, okay, I have to get home. Like I know I'm pushing it. Like I need to get home. Like Jim could be waiting at my house. So he tries to leave, and all of a sudden, Kate, the other sister, grabs him and is like basically trying to hook up with him. And so what we learned is like last year he had like drank, which he doesn't like drinking, but he was like trying to get courage to like kiss Sierra. And so like Sierra had like went off into this like house party and he was supposed to meet her. So he goes in this room and he thinks that it's Sierra like coming in to kiss him, and it's Kate. And Kate like knows that he likes Sierra. And he's felt like so guilty and never told Sierra about this. And he basically feels like taken advantage of by Kate. So he tries to stay away from her. But tonight Kate's drunk and he just like snaps at her and he's like, this is not happening. Like not now, not before, not ever. And he makes her like think like, how would you feel if like I was you and you were me? Like she's like, I didn't think about it like that. Like all this stuff or whatever. And all of a sudden, like, the police are starting to show up. He sees lights, so he just takes off running, and, like, his monitor's buzzing anyway, so he's like, I gotta get home. Chapter 25 is staring through my rear view, and it's May 25th. And he just got home. He texts Marcus and is like, it died again, so, like, I'm putting on the charger. And an hour later, he sees Paul dropping all the Whitakers off at home. So the next morning, Marcus texts him and is like, oh, I'm proud of you for letting me know. And he says there's also no record of Eric being missing. So Dre texts Sierra and says, like, I can't take any risk anymore. And then he asks Boogie to come over. So him and Boogie are just talking. And, like, Boogie is, like, at this point, he wants to go to college anywhere that's going to be open. And he, like, just can't take this quarantine stuff anymore. And Dre, like, never even opened his college acceptances. So, like, he knows, like, he's probably, like, forfeited all his chances, basically. And he tells Boogie his concerns about, like, the Whitakers. And Boogie says, like, why did it take you so long to realize that Eric set you up, basically? And Dre basically, like, Boogie's like, you were an outsider. Like, you're a poor black kid. You were an easy target to them, basically. And in the background, Dre's grandma turns up the news, and it's basically, like, the George Floyd stuff. Mm-hmm. So, Dre also, like, keeps telling Boogie about last night and how he thinks Paul is involved. But Boogie's just not really sure. But they both think that the Whitakers have shipped Eric off somewhere. And he just knows that Eric wouldn't leave Sierra like that. 26. Put your hands where my eyes can see. It's May 27th. And he is, like, trying to, like, avoid all this George Floyd stuff. George Floyd stuff. That's hard to say fast. So, like, it's all over the news. And he's, like, it's just, like, triggering, like, PTSD for him. So he's, like, he can't take it. So he's, like, swimming. And, like, he'll go under the water. And he just, like, screams, like, under the water, like, trying to let it out. And he, like, likes to go under there because he knows they can't see him when he's under the water that deep. So he's like trying to just like deal with his emotions. He gets home and he finds Sierra looking at his window, and Kate and Brian are there too. And like basically they're like, we're gonna go protest, like you should come with us. And like Sierra says, like, my parents don't think it's the right thing to do, but I'm going. And he's like, yeah, I'm good. Like I'm not doing that. And Sierra tells Kate and Brian like to go ahead, and she tells Dre like, I'm concerned. And Dre's just like, I'm tired. I'm tired. I can't deal with this. And so Sierra's like, I'll call you later. So the next few days, like all of the George Floyd stuff really starts like firing up. There's like outcries everywhere. There's protests. And then we got like the Ahmaud Arbery, which is, okay, so if anyone's listening to this possibly does not know what I'm talking about, George Floyd is the man who the police officer like kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and killed him. And then Ahmaud Arbery was the black man who was like running in his neighborhood, and these 3 white men literally chased him down and murdered him, even though they claimed that they thought he was robbing or something like that, whatever. So that's that. And then he also mentioned Breonna Taylor. So Breonna Taylor was in Kentucky, and she was the one who like they did like a no-knock warrant at her apartment and like just shot up the place, and she was killed. So, like, all of these things are going on all at the same time. So Dre goes to the corner store and like he goes, this pissed me off so bad. He goes in there to buy candy and the clerk is like, it's a white man. He goes, oh, like you don't have to pay for it. And Dre's like, no, I have money. He's like, no, like Black Lives Matter. That would have pissed me off so bad. Like, no, here, I'm paying for this. Goodbye. That's not what that means. If anyone thinks that's what that means, that's not what that means. So he's like, whatever. So he leaves and he's thinking like, okay, like that's funny that you say that because this store literally used to be owned by a black man who got pushed out of here. Right. And now you're like, oh, Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Like now you have this man's store. And it's funny because he's like, yeah, your store gets to be open because you sell groceries. But he's like, basically, if that black man was still owning it, he pretty much is like, they probably would have made him be closed and like not making money. So he gets a text from his dad saying like, you're cutting it close to curfew. And then all of a sudden the cops pull up. And they're like, get your hands out of your pockets, get down on the ground. And he's like, I don't know what to do because he's like, I don't want to put my hands out of my pockets because they're going to think I have a gun. And he's like, I can't get down on the ground without putting my hands on my pockets. And they're just like yelling at him. And he's like, I don't know what to do. So he like pulls his hands out. He's like, it's just candy. Like it's a candy bar. And they slam him on the ground, like slam his head on the ground. They tackle him and like they put their knees in his back. They start unzipping his hoodie, like his pop. He must have like a glass pop. It breaks. All the neighbors outside, they're watching, they're recording. And like they wipe his face off basically. And then someone calls his name and he looks up and it's Marcus. And Marcus like basically is like, that's my nephew. Like he doesn't say like who he is or whatever. And the police are like, oh, like, well, somebody called in a suspicious man, blah, 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 blah. And Marcus like takes him home. They don't talk. He just drops him off at home. And like Marcus leaves. Like he's like, we don't have to talk about it. He just drops him off at home. Chapter 27 is Dream On. It's May 28th. And he's just really surprised that the Black Lives Matter movement is growing. Because like in the past, like things have like sparked and they died out quickly. Mm-hmm. But this is like really catching fire. And his dad is at the bookshop because like things have really blown up. So like his dad is still like recovering from COVID, but obviously because Black Lives Matter is popular now, it's trendy, then the bookstore is booming because all of these people are calling. Like this woman calls and she's like, I need this book with a black man on the cover. And he's like, okay, can you be more specific? She's like, well, I saw it on the news. And I'm like, what? And he's like, I'm trying to see, what did she say? He's like, you know what? I think that might be part of our mass incarceration package. And the guy that works at the store with his dad is like, we don't have a mass incarceration starter package. And he's like, oh, I know. I just made it up. Just send her a whole bunch of black books, basically. Because the lady's like, sure, I'll take that. Like, not even like caring about this. Like, they're just buying it because this is trendy now. Mm-hmm. And he like, there's like Black Lives Matter flag everywhere. The Whitaker signs, like the election signs are also now in everyone's yards. And he like kicks the one down in their yard. Like he's pissed. And then he passes by that same lady with the same dog who was like, don't be like running through our yards with your trash or whatever she said. And now she's like, oh, hi, Andre. So you do know who I am. And he's like, oh, so you do know who I am. Like that's wild to me. That's wild. And he really like, even though like the Black Lives Matter stuff is popping up, he feels so unseen by what just happened to him because it's like, it was just like ran over by like this being trendy now. And it just took everything away from that. But his dad's like doing curbside deliveries and like actual deliveries, and people are like want different like black books for their book club. And then Mr. Whitaker comes into the store and he's like, oh, like you guys should get a website. Like I can help you with that. And Dre's like, why are you helping? And he says, oh, I've been offering to buy the bookstore for years. And he's like, I'm sorry, what? He says, you sold the bookstore? And his dad's like, no, I didn't sell it. I took a loan. And he's like, oh God. He wants to get away from the Whitakers so bad. So Mr. Whitaker's like, well, I want to make a better world for Sierra. And Dre says, and Eric? And he's like, what? And he's like, Sierra and Eric? And he's like, yeah, and Eric. Like, sure. And then Dre mentions the doctor. He's like, oh yeah, I saw Dr. So-and-so from the hospital. And Mr. Whitaker's like, who? He's like, like from the psychiatrist. He's like, oh, like, yeah, tell her I say hi or whatever. And Dre's like, yeah, you don't even know who that is because you were never there. Chapter 28 is Creep. And it's May 28th. And Mrs. Whitaker asked Dre to come over. And she's like, it's so quiet because the kids are always out protesting now. And she asked him like why he's not out there with him. and basically says that Mr. Whitaker is being bullied now to drop out of the race so a black person can run. And she's like, aren't we nice people? We have black children.
Oh, wow. Good for you.
Tone deaf. Like, what? I said, girl, what? And she says, I mean, Louisa's parents didn't even have papers. They were illegals. You make me want to vomit. So he literally like snaps. He's like, because she's just like victim. He's like, you don't get to pick and choose like what's good for our community. Like, just because you feel like that's good for this community, like that doesn't mean that it is and that's what we want. And he's like, you're not saving anybody. And she's like, I didn't say that. And he's like, you're having a pity party. And he says like, what about this community have you made better? And he says like, she's like, oh, I do the community garden. He's like, no, you move the community garden like that one of the older black residents had actually started. And like now we have to walk like 3 blocks to get to it or whatever. And she's like, well, I didn't know. And he's like, no, you didn't listen. And she said, well, like, it's better for everyone now. And he's like, no, it's not.
Better for you.
It's better for you. And she says, well, I'm making the community better for everyone. And he says, for who? And he's like, every improvement that you make to this community makes it so that we're priced out of our homes. Like all of the people who like grew up here and the black families who have had these homes for years can't even afford to live here anymore because like gentrification, basically, like you're making it impossible for them to have their community. And he says, if you're going to be part of our neighborhood, then you need to be a part of it, like not change it to fit yourself, basically. And he's like, do you even really care? Or like, is this all just for the politics? And he says, you should focus on your family. Like, why are you making Brian stay at home when you can afford it? And why is Kate telling everyone that, why is Kate afraid to tell you that she didn't get into Brown? And also, why didn't you file a missing person on Eric? And so she's like, you know what? I've drank too much wine. I'm going to go to bed. Like, can you just lock up on your way out? Like, no, I'm not going to lock up on my way out. I'm going to snoop your house. And that's exactly what he does. Chapter 29, you can't touch this. And it's May 29th still. So he goes to Mr. Whitaker's office. And he finds a file. Well, first he finds papers showing when Mr. Whitaker filed to run for office. And it's before he went to jail. So Mr. Whitaker had said like, oh, like your case inspired me to run for office. No, you were already planning on running. And you just didn't tell anyone until my case because that made you look good. And then he finds a file that says Jackson, and it's all about him. And there's an email from Gavin's dad. And basically, Mr. Whitaker had told Gavin's dad that Eric wouldn't be turning himself in, so there wasn't any reason to panic. And then the next day after that email was when Mr. Whitaker had gotten Dre a lawyer. He also finds papers about different boarding schools, and he like takes pictures of all this stuff. And he gets ready to leave, but he decides to go up to Eric's room. And he's like, there's literally no sign of Eric. He's like, even if Eric did leave, like he wouldn't have taken every poster, every paper, everything. But he's like, there's nothing of Eric in this room. So he knows that Eric has like a hiding place in the closet. So he goes and reaches in there, and his mom's necklace is still in there, plus like other stuff. And he's like, he would not have left this stuff here. And he like is going to like, he finds some files and he's going to open them, but then he hears footsteps. Chapter 30 is Living on a Prayer. Also love that one. May 29th. So he's like holding his breath because Mr. Whitaker comes into the room and he literally gets all the way up to the closet, but then his phone rings and he leaves. But like when Mr. Whitaker was in there, he like stopped and like looked at the ground and was just like looking all weird. So he sneaks out and like takes some of Eric's stuff, and he gets home to his room and he like finds a copy of Dre's arrest record and a list of all the things that were stolen. And he also has a list of all Eric's passwords, and he checks Eric's emails, and they all have been unread. And same with all his social medias. And then he sees a video of Eric talking about art because Eric was an artist. And basically he started to sell some of his art, and the starting bid was at $800. But Eric hasn't cashed any of it out, and it's now up to like $37,000, which is plenty of money for him to live on if he wanted to. So why wouldn't he have cashed it out? Right. Chapter 31 is X Factor. It's May 29th. He sneaks over to Sierra's and taps on her window, and she like kind of snaps at him because like she wants him to come protest, and she doesn't understand why he won't. And he says like, and she tells him like, that could be you. And he says, no, it was me. It actually was me. And he's like, you know, you live over here in your big house with your white parents and you're fine, but like you don't actually experience what I experience. And he's like, I'm protecting my life by not being out there. And she's like, it's not easy for me and Eric just because like we have white parents. Like that doesn't just make it easy for us. So he shows her Eric's necklace and tells her what he found. And she says her parents said that they basically should forget about Eric and just move on, which is crazy to say.
Yeah.
That's absolutely crazy. Like, you don't just forget a sibling's missing, especially like a couple months after. It's not like it's been 10 years or something. You never forget that. And she says at first she was mad at Dre because she thought that he knew where Eric was until she found the letters, like when he was locked up. Like, she thought when Eric ran away that Dre knew this whole time, but then she found his letters and realized, okay, he doesn't know where Eric is. And she says that her parents said they filed a police report, but they told them that basically, like, because Eric is almost 18, the police weren't going to do anything. So Dre reminds her of how, like, Brian had, like, come home late for prom one year and how his parents did, like, absolutely everything to find him, like, called the police. And then he's like, why haven't they done that for Eric? Like, why aren't they doing that? And that was just, like, one night. It's been months that Eric's been gone. And he asked her, have you told anyone else that Eric's gone besides, like, talking to your parents about it, like a counselor or anybody? And she says no. So he tells her that Eric was never reported missing and tells her that what Mr. Whitaker had told him about Eric's mental health. And she's like, Eric wasn't using drugs. Dre says, well, I found applications for boarding schools. And she says, okay, well, I'm going to talk to my dad. And then, like, she moves and kind of, like, winces. And he says, is something hurting you? And she says, no. And he's like, no more secrets. And he doesn't think that it's Paul hurting her anymore. He says, how long has this been happening? And she doesn't want to tell him. And he says, it's, she ends up saying, like, it's been since Eric's left. And basically, Eric shielded her while they were living together. But now that Eric is gone, Louise is trying to take Eric's place, which is why Louise has been, like, acting up to kind of, like, distract from Sierra so that she doesn't get these beatings, basically. And Sierra says, if I do what he says, then he's nice. But it's gotten worse due to quarantine and us, like, all being stuck in the same house. And basically, since Eric's left, like, their mom barely looks at her. All she does is take pills and drink wine. And Sierra says, Eric's not coming home, is he? And Dre says, like, don't confront your dad. It might just make it worse. Chapter 32 is You Got Me. It's May 31st. And Dre is swimming, and he goes to the locker room to change. And that's the last place that he hasn't searched. His locker, and Eric had a locker as well. So first he checks his locker. There's nothing there. But then he checks Eric's locker, and there is a full stash in there. $5,000 in cash. So, chapter 33, Can We Talk? Can we talk for a minute? May 31st. So, he trusts Boogie, so he calls Boogie and tells him, like, I found the stash or whatever. And Dre tells him about, like, what he found at the Whitakers and about Sierra's bruises. And he's like, maybe I should just blackmail Mr. Whitaker. And Boogie's like, nope, that's probably going to backfire. So, he's like, I have to figure out how to get to Mr. Whitaker. So, he decides to go to where his mom has been staying, like, during this whole COVID stuff, and he just tells her, like, I missed you, I came to see you. And Marcus calls, and like, they're both, like, he's talking to Marcus and his mom, and, like, he's like, oh, like, he's talking about Sierra, and Marcus is like, you should get her a flower and mixtape. Like, it's not 1980, Marcus. But he tells his mom basically all of the main stuff about Eric being missing, and she's pissed because she's like, you're risking your freedom, like, doing all this investigative work. And she's like, I'm glad that you came to me, and I'm sorry I snapped on you originally. But he tells her, like, about Sierra's bruises, and she's like, we can't do anything about that until Sierra's willing to, like, come forward and talk about them. And we have to know more. And she says, this is dangerous for you and for us. And she tells him, so when they were 12, his grandma said that they left for a couple of weeks. Well, his mom says that when they were 12, Mrs. Whitaker was actually taken to the hospital with Sierra, Louise, and Eric. And she said when they came to the hospital, they had called social services on them. But by the time social services got there, Mr. Whitaker was there, and they had lawyered up, and no one could talk to them. And that Mr. Whitaker approached his mom for help. And she says, like, you just don't, like, you don't deal with people like that. And she says that when Sierra and Eric had left for a couple of weeks, or she says that's when Sierra and Eric left for a couple of weeks, and then they came back, and the Whitakers, like, very quickly adopted them after that. And prior to whatever this incident was, Mrs. Whitaker basically had wanted to get rid of Eric, Louise, and Sierra. She basically, like, was like, adoption's not what she thought it was going to be, and she wanted to get rid of them. And the old foster parents had come and tried to take Sierra and Eric back, but then the Whitakers accused them of abuse. And his mom says, like, look, I never liked you hanging around the Whitakers, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Mr. Whitaker is trying to get close to your dad. Sierra texts Dre and is like, I called those boarding schools and Eric isn't at any of them. So he leaves and calls Sierra and basically says, like, one of the schools they had run a check to, but they canceled the check on January 6th and that he was never there. And she starts crying, saying, like, my dad did this, and she hangs up the phone, and now her phone is just going straight to voicemail. Chapter 34, Don't Stop Believing. It's June 2nd, and he has not been able to get a hold of Sierra since her phone went to voicemail. And now, like, the protesters have anti-protesters. So you remember people were out there, like, all lives matter, Black lives matter, like, back and forth. So Louise is on the news because there's a picture of him, like, holding this older man, and all Drake can think is, like, Louise looks terrified in this picture. Like, he doesn't look, like, compassionate. It looks terrifying. And he remembers his grandma saying how Eric did come back one day after he left, and then he left again. And so she says, he asked his grandma, and she's like, you know, when I saw Eric at home, the only person home was Mrs. Whitaker, and then Mr. Whitaker showed up, and then he left later in Eric's car. So Dre looks and he realizes that he was supposed to be at a concert with the other Whitaker kids that night. So he knows that all the other Whitaker kids were gone the night that his grandma says Eric came home. The news is on and Mr. Whitaker is on, and he's basically like using this picture with Louise to like promote himself and saying how he wants his families to have like equality for all minorities because he has minority children and blah, 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 blah. And since he's on the news, he knows it's safe. So Dre sneaks back over to the Whitakers, which I think was a bad idea. Mm-hmm. But he goes to find the folders, and now everything is gone. And he goes to Eric's room, and all that stuff is gone. So then he goes over to Louise's room, but then he hears the garage door opening. So he, like, literally has to sneak out on the roof, and, like, he falls off the roof and has to sneak back home. 35, Ready or Not, and it's June 2nd. So he sees everyone come home but Sierra, and he sees Louise, and he calls them over, and he's like, where's Sierra? And Louise says, like, she decided to stay at the rally. And Dre says, like, what happened to Eric? And Louise says, like, he's better off now, like, just leave me alone. And Dre says, like, I know about the summer that you guys left. And Louise says, like, stop bringing up bad memories, like, we don't need you over here doing that. So Dre asks him, like, do they hurt you too? And Louise says, Sierra's bruises probably just happened on accident. Like, I just want our lives to go back to normal. So Louise starts talking about the incident. He's like, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, basically, my mom was running the car with us in the garage. She tried to murder you. Mm-hmm. So essentially, Mrs. Whitaker got in the garage and tried to kill herself and killed the kids by running the car and give them carbon monoxide poisoning. And he's like, well, she's better now. She's never done it again. Like, it's not a big deal. Yes, it is. And Dre is like, I don't even know what to say. So then Kate comes in and she's like, leave my brother alone. But then Kate says, like, mom wasn't trying to get attention from dad. Like, and so Kate was actually the one that found them in the garage. And she says, like, she opened the door. Everyone was like falling asleep in the car. So she opened the garage door and she tried to wake everyone up. She called the ambulance and she says, like, mom would have let herself and all of you die. And Dre says, are you okay? And Kate just says, like, that was a long time ago. Like, it's fine. And she says, Sierra won't stop bringing up Eric. And that's why we go to the protest with her because, like, we're worried that she's just going to, like, do something crazy. And we're trying to make sure she doesn't get out of control. And she says, like, I hope he'll just come back. And Dre says, he's not. Chapter 36 is Everybody Wants to Rule the World. It's still June 2nd. And Dre passes Mr. Whitaker doing a CNN interview in his office, so he stops to listen. And Mr. Whitaker says, like, well, he wants the protest to stop because of COVID, and the governor and the mayor aren't controlling the pandemic, and he wants the city to stay whole, and we all know that Black Lives Matter, so we need to stop putting our lives at risk for these protests, after you just literally sat out there and was like, oh, this is so wonderful. So Dre is pissed because he's like, you know, you're using the Black Lives Matter movement, and now it's inconvenient for you. So he gets off of that call, and then he immediately gets on a video call with Officer Jim. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Whitaker says, like, I told you don't call me. And Jim says, you know, something's going down at the protest. Basically, there's an underground group of terrorists there, because that's what I'm going to call them. And they're going to pretend to be the protesters, but, like, make it look like they're like, tearing everything up so that people will, like, attack the protesters. Jim tells Mr. Whitaker, like, you just need to change the narrative of Black Lives Matter and make them look like a terrorist group. And he says, don't forget about me when you get elected. I want a seat on the board or whatever. And Whitaker says, you just keep an eye on that kid. So then Mrs. Whitaker is coming down the stairs, and so, like, Dre runs into the kitchen, but he notices that Brian has been watching them this whole time. So he's like, crap, somebody saw me. And Mr. Whitaker tells Mrs. Whitaker, like, call the kids and make sure they get home because, like, I can't basically, like, say I'm against the protests and, like, my kids are out there. And she's like, well, you know who won't come or whatever. But he's like, call them anyways. Chapter 37, Only God Can Judge Me. It's still June 2nd. So Dre leaves and Louise and Kate, like, run behind him. And they're like, Brian's freaking out, saying, like, something about our parents. And then Mrs. Whitaker calls Kate and says, like, they need to come home because COVID outbreaks. And Dre tells them, like, what he heard. And Kate tries to defend it, but then Dre says, like, look, your dad wanted me watched. And Louise says, like, stop being surprised to Kate. He was like, he literally supported the wall being built. And Brian calls Dre, saying, like, Sierra's not answering her phone, and she doesn't answer for any of them, so they have to go find her. So Kate and Louise go downtown to find her. Chapter 38 is Too Legit to Quit. So Sierra finally calls and she's like, I'm downtown. And she's like, I'm staying and I'm taking my dad down the only way I know how. And she says, Eric's gone. She's like, I checked the closet and found letters. And basically, Eric had wrote her a bunch of letters and is like, if you found this, like, I'm dead, basically. And he also had left her their mom's suicide letter from years ago. And she's planning to read these letters on a news interview at the protest. So she hangs up and Dre calls Louise. And basically he's like, okay, I'm going to let my monitor die and I'm going to go to the protest. Oh my gosh. So Boogie's like outside waiting for him. And he's like, look, we got an hour. Like, let's go do this. So they go downtown and they go into the crowd and they find Kate and Louise. And Dre starts seeing all of these people with, like, the yellow and black ribbon, which is what Jim said they would look like, the, like, undercover people or whatever. And so he's, like, trying to reason with Sierra, and Marcus calls. And he's like, he tries to sound like sleep, and Marcus is like, wake up and charge your monitor. And Marcus says, like, I'm doing a house check, and Jim is on the way to your house. And he lies, and he's like, I'm not home. I'm with Terry. Like, he's like, okay, I'm not asleep. Like, I'm just not home or whatever. And then Boogie says, call Terry and see if he'll cover for you. And he calls Terry and Terry's like, explain. And then Terry says, like, okay, I'm going to meet you, like, at this location. If you're there, I'll take you home and I'll cover for you. If you're not there, don't mention my name. You never heard of me. So he also asked Terry one last thing. He's like, can you search the swipe records for the rec center to see who could have planted the bag? He's like, search for, like, Eric, Mr. Whitaker, Paul, Gavin. And then his dad calls and says that Jim, the probation officer, is there. And he's like, I'm with Terry. So Sierra's like, Dre, you need to go home, but I'm going to stay here and read the letters. But he keeps seeing all these men with, like, the yellow and black ribbon, and he knows that they're trying to, like, burn down the city. So he's like, I'm not leaving. And then a bunch of men appear in freaking riot gear. So chapter 39, set it off. And it's still the same day. So he's like, we need to disperse the crowd. And he's like, you know what? I'm just going to go live on YouTube. Which I was like, that is so stupid. Everyone's going to know that you were there now. I thought you were trying to be incognito. Like, because he's, like, got a mask and, like, a hoodie on and stuff. But I'm like, okay, obviously if you're live, you broke your cover. Which is what his grandma says later, too. But he goes live, and he's, like, telling people about, like, the people pretending to be protesters. And there's, like, a guy, like, with a bat. He's vandalizing. Vans start snatching people off the streets. And Sierra still will not leave. And so Boogie and Sierra are like, Dre, like, you got to go home. You got to go home. Chapter 40 is Don't Believe the Hype. So now his dad is calling him and he just ignores it. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to call Mr. Whitaker. So he FaceTimes Mr. Whitaker and he basically puts him on the live. And he says, why did you allow a group of underground people to infiltrate, like, Black Lives Matter? And he says, you shut Eric up when he threatened your political aspirations. And he says, you're also working with the probation officer to set me up. So Mr. Whitaker lies and says, like, then Dre lies and he's like, I recorded your conversation with with Jim tonight in your office. And Mr. Whitaker is like, how much is it going to take for you to stay quiet or whatever? And he's like, you know, I can pay off your dad's debts at the bookstore. And Dre says, admit what you did. And he's like, well, I'll just wipe your dad's debt clean. Like, come by the house. We can talk about it. And I'm like, don't you go by that house. And Mr. Whitaker's like, well, no one's going to believe you. Like, you know, no one's going to listen to a kid that went to juvie, blah, 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 blah. And Boogie tells him, like, you're on CNN. And then Mrs. Whitaker runs into Mr. Whitaker's office and shows him, like, he's on TV. And so he hangs up. And so Dre starts talking to the news and he's like, I was scared to leave my house because I was forced to take credit for something I didn't do. And then Sierra pulls out the letters. And the letter says, if you're reading this, things turned out badly for me. Get this to the police. Tell them about the abuse. Tell them about everything. Tell them about mom's suicide attempt. Tell them about the foster parents. Tell them Andre is innocent and I was the one behind the robberies because I was desperate to start my own life. In the letter, Eric also said that he was hiding money and that you can take it to the police station and that he knows that his parents are dangerous and knows what they're capable of. And Sierra tells Louise to call a lawyer that she had a number for and like take everything to him. So they leave and they're trying to cross the bridge to get to Terry to like meet him on time. And Sierra says like, do you think that they'll clear your name after tonight so you're not in trouble? And she's basically like, I wasn't ready for my life to blow up like this, but I guess it is. Chapter 41 is in the air tonight. So she wants to do like a demonstration. And so they do a 8-minute and 36-second moment of silence for George Floyd. And Dre gives her like one of his earbuds and they listen to In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins. And at this point, he has 1 million followers now on his YouTube. And it starts raining. So like, even though they were throwing like tear gas at them, it's like really not working because it started like raining while like all this stuff was going on. Chapter 42 is Crossroads, and it's still the same night. And so he's able to like get to Terry in time. And when they pull up to the house, of course, Officer Jim is waiting. And Louise and Kate pull up after them. And Jim has like basically ransacked his whole room because he wasn't home and found the backpack full of money. And then Marcus pulls up too. And Dre just like falls to the floor because he's like, I'm not going to, like, I can't believe this. And Terry's like, that's not his backpack. And Marcus asks like Jim, like, did you have a warrant? But Jim's like, I didn't need a warrant. He wasn't home, blah, 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 blah. So Marcus tells Jim, like, I did some digging. And he basically found out that Jim had himself placed as Marcus's replacement, like if something happened without approval. And Marcus is like, you should go. And Jim says he's not going anywhere. So basically they ask Jim, like, what did you have to do with like what just happened downtown? And they're like, look, Mr. Whitaker's going to plant everything on you. So if you're smart, like you might as well go ahead and get up out of here. Dre's grandma says like, what were you thinking going live? Like that just proves you weren't home, which is what I said. And then Brian comes and says like, it wasn't Eric who put that bag in your locker. It was me. And Sierra's like, oh my God, like, no. And Brian says, like, I didn't know that it was your locker. He said that basically his dad came to him and was like, Eric's in trouble. He's facing 10 years. I need you to put this bag in someone's locker. And it ended up being Dre's locker. And Brian says after today, he knows that his dad was lying. And he thought this whole time that Eric would end up coming home. So Dre tells them, like, you guys can stay with us. And Louise says, like, he actually knows something too. So Louise actually came home that night that he was supposed to be at the concert with them, and he found the banister broken, and he's like, he heard arguing. He just went to his room and like laid down and pretended to be asleep. And he said he heard Eric and them arguing with his parents, and then he said everything just went completely silent. And then he said he went out on the roof and saw like his dad piling all of Eric's things in his mom's robe in a metal can and set it on fire. And then he saw like a tarp, but he couldn't see what was under it. So he went back in his room and just like played sleep and put his headphones on. And he's like, his mom came in and he just like was super still. And then he said the next morning he woke up and she was just like sitting there staring at him and was like, oh, I didn't know you were home. And like Eric left. Like, you psycho lady. And he says this whole time he thought it was Mr. Whitaker, or Dre says this whole time he thought it was Mr. Whitaker, but it was actually Mrs. Whitaker. And Brian says that basically the dad covers up for her and tries to make like the problems go away. And Kate says that their mom never even called Sierra that night to get her to leave the protest. She only called the other kids. And Marcus says like, Dre, I'm sorry I have to do this, but I have to take you into jail. And he's like, what? And he's like, you broke perimeter. Like, I have to take you into jail. And he's like, I knew you were the police, like, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, look, I have to take you in because if I want to report Jim, I have to do everything by the book. And so if I don't take you in, like, they're not going to listen to what I have to say. Chapter 43 is like a prayer. It's June 4th. And Dre is not as angry anymore. He understands why Marcus had to take him in, but they let him go like immediately because of all the COVID precautions. And he's got a new lawyer, and they're doing Zoom court to basically reassess his case. And they basically say, like, they're going to keep him on the home monitoring program, and they want him to get a new monitor that actually charges. And Marcus, like, basically sends him a bunch of text bombs, like, with the black fist emoji until Dre responds. And he's on his way home with his dad, and as they approach, their street is blocked off, and then the Whitaker's house is all taped off. And so the news has been covering Eric's disappearance and like how the Whitakers were able to adopt them even after the suicide attempt, and how social services haven't intervened. And the kids have all been staying with Dre and them because everyone's 18 now except for Louise. And basically the police have finally got a warrant and they're able to search the house, but they're not finding anything. And one of the officers is the officer that literally like tackled him to the ground that night outside the convenience store. And Dre thinks back to how the night that he was arrested, Eric was in the background. And he remembers like where Eric was standing in that video. And he looks over there and now there's a bunch of rose bushes. And he just starts screaming. He's like, the roses, the roses. He's under the roses. So Sierra starts like digging and like Mrs. Whitaker tries to grab at her. And like they all start digging. And Louise is like, there was a tarp here. And then the next day the roses appeared. And so they dig. And then the police are like, we've got something. Chapter 44, Kiss from a Rose. It's July 6th. So the Whitakers were arrested and they lawyered up and they basically said like, we were set up. Somebody must have put Eric's body there. Like they knew we were going to plant roses. Brian has moved back in the house and he filed for guardianship of Louise, and the other kids like refused to go back home. So Dre goes back to the house, to the Whitaker's house, and he goes to Eric's room for the first time since everything's happened. And he like stands there and he thinks about that night when he was in the closet and like how Mr. Whitaker looks, and he knows that like it was in this room that they must have killed Eric. Sierra's been staying like with her old foster parents some, and she basically like they're trying to decide what to do with the roses that they had dug up, but she basically wanted them to replant them because she feels like Eric is a part of those roses now. So they do. And they're all like, all of their friends in them, they've all kind of like gathered around and they're just kind of like having a remembrance of Eric and like saying things about him. And Dre says like he's sorry he couldn't see like that Eric was basically being abused and like didn't see what was happening to him. And Kate writes Dre an apology letter, which he still doesn't like deal with her, but she's basically like, I'm sorry for like trying to like hook up with you and like forcing that on you. And then that is the end. We go to the epilogue and it's August. The bookstore is actually still hanging on, and Dre was offered a full ride to Morehouse College, which he's always wanted to go to at HBCU, but he's decided to stay a local. Sierra couldn't afford to go to college with all the stuff that happened with the Whitakers, but they basically, a GoFundMe was raised for her because of the stuff with Eric, and she was able to get enough money for like 4 years to go to college. And basically like that's what they're like, oh, are you staying around here because Sierra's staying around here? And his record ended up getting expunged, and Terry and Marcus are now working together for like youth programs for troubled youth in the area. And that's the end. And also on Spotify, there is a playlist. It's called Andre's Playlist. If you like search that and Invisible Sun, it'll pop up on Spotify. So I thought that was kind of cool. Okay. Lengthy. So, what did you think?
I really enjoyed this. My mom was the one that requested that we do this. She was the one, she like hounded me to listen to this, to listen to the audiobook. And I finally did, and I was like, I love it. I ended up rating it 5 stars.
Okay. Yeah, I think I did 4.5. It was really good.
I really enjoyed it.
I did too. I didn't expect the murder. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I thought Invisible. I didn't know what I thought it meant. And then like when it started, I was like, okay, it must have something to do with like just him being in the system. Like I wasn't expecting the COVID stuff. I wasn't expecting like the Black Lives Matter stuff really. And then I definitely wasn't expecting like the murder stuff.
Yeah. I think I pretty much went into it blind as well, just because my mom was like, it's so good, you
I know your mom was like, it's so good, you have to do it.
I did bawl when his grandpa died.
That tore me up, like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many people that happened to, and that is just like, they just left one day and they just never come home. And it's so sad, and I'm so thankful. I was so like cautious of my grandparents, and I'm so glad that and thankful that they did not get COVID. But yeah, like it's just like that's so sad. And like yeah, like I get it. Like my grandparents get on my nerve. Like my grandpa does like the same stuff all the time, and like but like I know like whenever he's not here anymore, like I'm gonna just like want him to say those same annoying things to me all the time. And so like I get that, and then like I get the like the insignificance, like that feeling of like I'm just a number now. Like, my grandpa's death's not even, like, anything because 10,000 people died today. Like, he's just a drop in the bucket. So, like, that is so sad. And then, like, the stuff with Eric, like, I feel like, again, like, we just did, like, Monday's Not Coming. It's, like, kind of the same thing. Like, these foster parents, or, like, social services. Like, my mom actually, so I said she did juvenile, but she actually worked for a foster company now. And, like, there are, like, those foster parents who, like, literally just do it for the money or whatever. And it's, like, why? And especially, like, in this case, like, why didn't you just let them go back to where they, like, that other family wanted them? You could have just let them go back. Like, you did not want these kids.
Yeah.
And you just, like, I'm assuming
kept them out of spite?
Out of spite or the money. I don't know. Like, I'm not really sure. I feel like once you adopt them, do you still get money? I don't really think they get as much money.
So.
If they get any. So it's like, why do you do that? And then, like, and Jen is just like, to think that Sierra was, like, not going to be looking for her brother.
Right.
That's crazy to me. Like, you should just get over it. I'm glad that, like, all the kids ended up, like, seeing it. Like, I assumed, like, Brian or, like, Kate was going to be like, no, like, on their parents' side. So I'm glad that that happened in the book. But yeah, like, that's just, that's so sad.
I think the whole reason for them keeping them was the further his political career and, you know, I'm not racist. I have black kids.
Yeah, like, like, that pissed me off so bad. And, like, people literally will say stuff like that, and it just, there's no, like, there's no thought in their mind. Like, that sounds weird. Like, that's such a weird thing to say. That is such a weird thing to say. Like, why are you saying that? And it's just like, or, like, the community stuff, like, you're not making it better. Like, these were people's shops. These were people's businesses. Like,
you're making it prettier for you. Yeah. You're making it your idea of better and not, what suits the community.
Yeah. This was a community before you lived here. And, like, like he said, like, you're coming in here and, like, making it change for you versus you fitting. Like, if you don't want to live here, then live somewhere else. Like, go live in an HOA because that's, like, that's what it sounds like you want to live in. So, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I really enjoyed it too. So I was glad we read it.
Yeah.
Do you have reviews?
I do. So our 5-star review from Alex says, Kim Johnson has a way of presenting the reality of systemic racism in a highly engaging story, an improvement over her first book, which I also liked. Love the music references in the chapter titles.
Me too.
Yeah, I did too.
I love it.
I'm one of those ones where you say, like, a little snippet of something that can be turned into a song or meme.
Oh, yeah.
And it's, like, instantly.
Yep.
So we don't have any... So there's 2 1-star ratings, but no reviews.
Oh.
Okay.
That's pleasant.
We do have for 2 stars. There are 17 2-star ratings and 5 reviews, so
I'm terrified.
Winter said, I wanted to love this book. Unfortunately, it just wasn't for me. My sincerest apologies to the author. However, this does not mean a different book will not be a perfect choice. And you know what? I respect that.
That was fair.
I respect that.
That wasn't bad. Yeah.
Because
you don't have to like every book.
Exactly. And you also don't have to bash it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, they were just saying that's not my cup of tea.
Yeah. That's fine.
Yep.
I respect that. I like that. I'm okay with that. So, okay. Well, our next book is Happy Place by Emily Henry.
Yes.
I got it right. See? Look at me. Look at me. We're way ahead.
Yeah.
We are way ahead of schedule because we're trying to be a more prepared group here. And summer's coming, so things happen.
We have some busyness.
Yeah, so we're trying to get our lives together. So we're preparing for you guys. So make sure that you are following us on all of the socials, all 3 of them, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok And make sure that your friends are also doing it.
Yes.
And share and review our podcast, if you would please. We really appreciate it. And I think that's all that we got.
That's all, folks.
Bye.
Bye.